Chapter 17 of The Mystery of the Locks by E.W. Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 17 The Pursuing Shadow. Allan Dorris and his wife had been up in the hills watching the sunset, and at dusk were returning leisurely home. They were very fond of the unfrequented locality where he had first declared his passion, and when the weather was fine they frequently visited it to imagine themselves lovers again, which was easy enough, for as man and wife they got along amazingly well. And now, when they were returning at nightfall, a shadow crept after them, from bush to rock and from tree to shrub, crawling and stealing along like a beast watching its prey. Pretty Annie Dorris, prettier than ever before, was expressing a fear in her winning way that their happiness was too great to last, and that something dreadful would happen to them. But she had no suspicion of the lurking, creeping shadow which had hurried forward and now stood almost within arm's length as her husband replied, "I have been so discontented all my life, and am so contented now, that I believe the fates will guard me from it in pity. It is not much that I ask, a country girl to be my wife and love me, nothing more. And it will always be my endeavor to be so useful to the country girl that she will be happy too, so that the simple boon of peace is not too much to ask when it will make two people entirely happy. I cheerfully give up my place in the strife for greatness and riches in which men seem to be always engaged, and will be content with the good health and plenty which my simple life here will bring me. As for a living, I can make that easy enough. I am making more even now than we can possibly spend. I hope your fears are not substantial." The country girl had her arm through her husband's, and she looked up into his face with such a troubled expression that he stopped in the road. "It may be that I am fearful only because I love you so much," she said. "It almost kills me when I think that any harm might happen to you." "I am glad to hear you say that," he replied, "but you are always saying something which pleases me. You look handsome tonight. You look prettier now than before you were married, and I think more of you. You don't fade out, and I love you for that. You are as fresh and as girlish as you ever were before we were married. I think it an evidence of good blood." "Now you are pleasing me," his wife said laughingly. "I have feared very often that you would not like me so well when you knew me better, and that you would finally tire of me." "But I don't," Dorris replied. "The more I know of you, the better I like you. It's not usual, but I am more in love after marriage than I was before." "I have mingled so little with women," the wife said seriously, "that I sometimes fear that I am not like others of my sex in manners and dress and inclination. Did you ever notice it?" "I think I have," he said. She turned upon him with mock fierceness and pretended to be very indignant. "Because you are not like other women, who act by rule and are nearly all alike, is the reason I have no greater ambition than to be tied to your apron strings," he said. "I think your freshness and originality are your greatest charms." "Long before I ever thought of becoming a wife myself," she said seriously again, "I noticed that most men seemed to lack a knowledge of women, that they regarded them as angels while they were girls, and were disappointed because they turned out to be women as wives. I am not unjust, but I have thought the women were partly responsible for this, since many of them exhibit themselves like dolls, and pretend to be more than they are. This is the reason why I am pleased that you are not disappointed in me." "As to your being an angel," he laughingly replied, "I know you are not one, and I am glad of it. I have an idea that an angel would soon tire of me, and fly away in disgust, to warn its companions that men were not worth saving. There are some women so amiable that no matter to what extent their affairs go wrong, they cannot muster up enough energetic regret to cause them to supply a remedy. I am not so fond of amiability as to desire it at that price. Whenever you find capacity, you will find temper, and I imagine that it would be dangerous to stir you up, for you are as capable a woman as I ever knew. Haven't you temper?" "Plenty of it. Too much," she answered. They both laughed at this frank confession, and Doris took occasion to say that there was not a spark of it in his nature, though there was temper written in every line of his countenance, and that he would have been an ugly man when once fully aroused was certain. They walked on again, and the shadow followed, as if anxious to hear what they were saying. "I can't account for it myself," Doris continued, "but I enjoy your company as much now as I did before we were married. It does me as much good to talk love to you. I suppose it must be because you deserve it. The fact that you were as careful to look well as you ever did may have something to do with it, but it is certainly the case. I have heard men abused a great deal for neglecting their wives after marriage, but it never occurs to me to neglect you. I don't want to neglect you. I think too much of you. If I should fail to be as considerate of you as you are of me, I know that I would no longer receive the full measure of your confidence and love, which is such a comfort to me. Therefore it is my first ambition to be just and honest with you in everything. The ambition affords me a great deal of pleasure, too, for I am never so well satisfied as when in your company. With you by my side, there is nothing else that I crave in this world or the next." "Oh, Allan, nothing in the next?" They had seated themselves on a rough seat in a sort of park on the hillside, and Doris considered the matter. "Well, if you go to heaven, I want to go. Of course you will go, for you are good enough, therefore I intend to do the best I can, so that when we come back to be judged, the Master will realize how much we love each other, and conclude not to separate us. But I depend on you. He will let me in to please you, not because I deserve it." "I know you do not think as I do about it," she answered, "but it is possible that you have not investigated as I have. I am not a foolish girl, but a serious woman, and have studied and thought a great deal, and I am certain there is something more than this life. I have never mentioned the subject to you before, because I know that a great many come to dislike religion because they hear so much of it from persons no better than themselves. But everything teaches us that we shall live again, and it worries me a great deal because you think lightly about a matter which seems so dreadfully serious. My mother's faith convinces me of it, though I cannot tell you why. I am not prepared, as she was, by a long life of purity, to receive the evidence. But promise me that you will think about it, and not combat your own judgment." "I have never thought about it much, and investigated but little," he answered. "It has always been natural for me to think of the grave as the end of everything, so far as I am concerned. But I have confidence in your intelligence and judgment. If you have investigated, and believe, that is enough for me. I believe. Please do not worry about it any more. I will try very hard to remain with you." He said it lightly, yet there was enough seriousness in his manner to convince her that his love for her was honest, even if his religion was not. "Religion is not natural with me. I feel no necessity for it, or lack of it," he said again. "But I have no objection to it. On the contrary, I have always liked the idea, but I lack the necessary faith. It would be pleasant for me to believe that in the next country, a day's journey removed, good gifts might be found. But if I could not believe it, I could not be reasonably blamed for my refusal to attempt the journey. I might even regret that the accounts were not true, but I would not insist that they were true against my honest convictions, because I hoped they were. I am religious enough in sentiment, but my brain is an inexorable skeptic. Nothing is more pleasing to me than the promise of your faith. What a blessed hope it is, that after death you will live in a land of perpetual summer, and exist forever with your friends where there is only peace and content. I am sure I can never see as much of you as I want to in this life, and I cannot tell you how much I hope we will be reunited beyond the grave, and live forever to love each other, even as we do now. I am willing to make any sacrifice necessary to ensure this future. It would be a pleasure for me to make greater sacrifices than are required, according to common rumor, for they are not at all exacting, except in the particular of faith. But that I lack, to a most alarming extent, though I cannot help it. You cannot have faith because it is your duty, any more than you can love because it is your duty. I only regret that I cannot be religious as naturally as I love you, but I cannot, though I try because you want me to. I want to believe that men do not grow old and become a burden to themselves and those around them. But I know differently, and while I hope that there will be a resurrection, I know that those who have gone away on the journey which begins with death send back no messenger, and that nothing is known of heaven except the declaration of pious people that they believe in it. I love to hear the laughter of children, but it does not convince me that all the world is in a laughing mood, and that there are no tears. No one can find fault with your religion except that they cannot believe in it. Everything in nature teaches us that we will return to dust, and that we will be resurrected only as dust by the idle winds. You don't mind that I speak freely?" "No." "I have tried all my life to convince myself that I possessed the spark of immortality, but my stubborn brain resists the attempt. All my reasoning convinces me that I live for the same reason that my horse exists. I am superior to the faithful animal only in intelligence, for in physical organization I am only an animal. When an animal dies, I see its body dwindle away until there is nothing left. It becomes dust again. I hope that I may share a different fate, but I believe that I shall pass away in precisely the same manner. Understand me, I want to be religious, but I cannot be. There are some people, I suppose there are a great many, though I never knew but one personally, who ought to live forever. They are too rare to die. You are one of them, but I fear you will be lost to the world in the course of nature. You ought to be preserved for the good you can accomplish by playing the organ. I never believe in heaven so much as when I am in the back pews listening to your music. There is more religion in the old organ when you are at the keyboard than in all the people who listen to it put together, and I sometimes think that those who write the music and the songs are inspired, though when you know them, their personal characters do not encourage that impression." She put her hand to his mouth as if to stop him, but he pushed it away with a laugh, and continued, "Let me finish, that you may know what I really am, and then I will never mention the subject again. But don't think me worse than other men for my unbelief. They nearly all think as I do, though only the bad ones say so. All good men rejoice that there is a pleasing hope in religion, and encourage it all they can, but only a few of them have your faith." "All be well yet, Allan," the wife answered. "You have promised to try and get rid of your unbelief, and I know that you will be honest in it. The Master whom I serve next to you, I fear I am becoming very wicked myself, for you are more to me than everything else." "There it is again," Doris said, looking at her, half laughing. "That expression wasn't studied, I know, but it pleases me greatly. You are always at it, though you have a right to now. He is more considerate than any of us imagine, and if he knows you did not believe, he will also know that you could not and did not intend any disrespect." "There is something in that," he answered. "I loved you before I knew you, though I did not believe you existed." "But you did find me. It is not impossible that you will find him, though you do not believe he exists." "That is worth thinking about. The next time I take a long ride into the country I will think it over, if I can get you out of my mind long enough. One thing, however, is certain. I want to follow you, wherever that leads me. Let me add, too, that in what I have said I intend no disrespect. It would be impudent in me, a single pebble in the sand surrounding the shores of eternity, to speak ill of a faith which is held by so many thousands of intelligent and worthy people. I speak freely to you as my wife, my confidante, that you may know what I am." "But you are leading, Allan, and I am following," she said. "You are kind enough to believe that my future is assured, but it is not unless you are saved. You can save both of us by saving yourself. If we were at the judgment now, and you should be cast out, I would follow you. I might be of some use to you even there." "That's horrible to think about," he replied, rising to his feet. "But it pleases me. Anyway, little woman, we are getting along delightfully here. I hope we will always be as well off as we are now. If the next world affords me as much pleasure as this one has during the past 3 months, I shall be more than satisfied. It is said that a man is very happy when he is in love, and I am growing more in love with my wife every day. I suppose it is because I never was in love before. I have had extensive experience in everything else. I know a little of everything else. This may be the reason why my honeymoon lasts so long." "When I met you that afternoon out in the hills," she answered, "you were such an expert at love-making that I was at first afraid of you. If ever man made a desperate, cunning love to a woman, you made it to me. But I soon got over my timidity, and knew you were only desperately in earnest, which made me love you until I went mad. I had nothing to give you but myself, and that I gave so readily that I sometimes fear, when you are away from me, I never think of it at any other time, that you accuse me for it." "It so happened," he answered, "that you did exactly what I wanted you to do, though I am not surprised at it now, since discovering how naturally you do 100 things a day to please me." "Accuse you?" He laughed good-naturedly at the thought. "Instead of that, it is the boast of my life that my sweetheart, my vision which came true, had so much confidence in me that she placed herself in my keeping without conditions or promises. You are the hope I have had all my life. You are the heaven I have coveted. And don't suppose that I find fault because the realization is better than the dream. When you go to heaven, and find that it is a better place than you imagined, you will not accuse the Master of a lack of propriety because he is more forgiving of your faults than you expected, nor do I. Dismiss that thought forever, to oblige me, and believe, instead, that your single fault turned out to be my greatest blessing. If I made desperate love to you up in the hills, it was natural, for I had no previous experience. I cannot remember that I ever was a young man. I was first a child, and then a man with grave responsibilities. But the fancy I told you about, the maid of air, I always loved it until I found you." Putting her arm through his, they walked toward the town, and the shadow emerged from a clump of bushes within a few feet of where they had been sitting. The married lovers walked on, unconscious of the presence, and occasionally the laugh of Mrs. Dorris came to the shadow on the wind, which caused it to listen anxiously and creep on after them again. In turning out of the path that led up into the hills, and coming into the road, Dorris and his wife met Tug and Silas, who were loitering about as usual, Tug in front carrying the gun, and Silas lagging behind. "What now?" Dorris said good-naturedly, on coming up with them. "What are you up to tonight?" "On a Wednesday night," Tug replied, putting the stock of the gun on the ground and turning his head to one side to get a square sight at the woman, "the woods are full of rabbits. We're out looking for them." "Why on Wednesday night?" Tug removed his gaze from Mrs. Dorris to Silas. "When do we find our game?" he inquired. "On Wednesday, at night," the little man answered meekly. "I don't know how it is myself," continued, this time taking a shot at Dorris, "but Wednesday it is. You are both looking mighty well." They thanked him for his politeness, and added that they were feeling well. "They didn't think much of you when you came," he said, pointing a finger at Dorris, which looked like a pistol, "but they have changed their minds. Even Reverend Wilton says you will do. It's the first kind word he has said of anybody. It came out— Silas, how did it come out?" "Like a tooth," Silas answered, who had been standing by with his hands in his pockets. "Like a back tooth, you told me. Come now, didn't you say a back tooth?" Silas muttered something which was accepted as an acknowledgment, and Tug went on, "Why didn't you say so, then? Why do you want to put it on me in the presence of the lady? But Reverend Wilton never said anything bad about you, or anybody else. He's too lazy for that. I only wonder that he didn't drop over from exhaustion when he said you'd do. Well, I should say you would do. Eh, pretty girl?" Annie Dorris made no other answer than to cling closer to her husband, and Tug regarded them with apparent pleasure. "And there's Uncle Ponsonboy. Silas, what does Uncle Ponsonboy say?" "He says that Mr. Dorris is a man of promise," Davy answered. "Oh, does he? Well, he's not the kind of a man of promise, old Uncle Ponsonboy is, who has been promising to distinguish himself for 40 years. Old Albert reminds me of a nephew of my wife's. I supported him 4 years in idleness, but he was always boasting that he was able to take care of himself, and that he asked favors of nobody. He used to fill up on my bread and meat, and lounge in front of my fire, and declare that he never knew solid content until he began to make his own living, although he did nothing except to write to his folks, and say that they needn't worry about him. He was able to take care of himself. But the old lady holds out against you." Tug swallowed a laugh with a great effort, apparently locking it up with a spring lock, for there was a click in his throat as he took aim at Dorris again, and continued, but not before his scalp had returned to its place after crawling over on his forehead to look at the smile. "I am glad of that, though. The old lady and I never agree on anything. I like the devil because she hates him. I shall be quite content in Purg if she fails to like it." Allan Dorris looked puzzled for a moment. "Oh, purgatory," he said, finishing the abbreviation, and turning to his wife, who laughed at the idea. "We were talking about that just before you came up." "Neither of you need worry about that," Tug said. "You are all right. I am the devil's partner, and I know. But if you should happen down there by any mischance, I will give you the best accommodation the place affords. If there is an ice box there, you shall have room in it. But no ice water for the old lady. I insist on that condition." They were very much amused at his odd talk, and promised that his instructions should be obeyed in case they became his guests. "But why are you the devil's partner?" Dorris asked. "He must have assistance, of course," Tug replied, "and I shall make application to enter his service as soon as I arrive. I want to get even with Uncle Ponsonboy." Tug locked up a laugh again with a sharp click of the lock, and his scalp hurried back to its place on learning that it was a false alarm. "I want to get a note from him to this effect: 'Dear Tug, for the sake of old acquaintance, send me a drop of water.' Whereupon I will take my iron pen in hand and reply, 'Uncle Ponsonboy, drink your tears.' Then I will instruct one of my devilish assistants to lock him up, and never let him see the cheerful light of the fires again. As the door closes, I will say to him, as I now say to you, good night." Tug and Silas walked toward the hills, and Dorris and his wife toward the town, but the shadow no longer followed them. It had disappeared. In case the shadow came back that night to prowl around the locks and peer in at the windows, it found a determined-looking man on guard, carrying a wicked-looking gun. Had the eyes of the shadow followed the feet of the man, it would have noted that they walked around the stone wall at regular intervals, and that they stopped occasionally, as if listening. It would have seen them strolling leisurely away at the first approach of dawn, carrying the gun and Tug's burly body with them. End of chapter 17. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 18 of The Mystery of the Locks by E.W. Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 18. The Rise in the River. The rain had been falling at intervals for weeks, and the sluggish river, which usually crawled at the foot of the town in quiet submission, had become a dangerous torrent. Long since out of its banks, its waters poured through the bottoms with an angry roar, and at night those who gathered on the brink in the town to mark its steady rising could hear cries of distress from the heavy timber, the firing of guns, and other alarms. For 2 days parties had been out with boats of every description, rescuing those who believed that the waters would soon go down, and remained until escape was impossible, imprisoned in the upper rooms of their houses. And each returning party brought the most distressing news yet heard of the havoc wrought by the flood. Reaching from hill to hill, the angry waters plowed up fair fields like heavy shot fired in battle, and crept into pretty homes to destroy in a night the work of years, wresting treasures from their fastenings with remorseless fury, and hurrying away with them like living thieves. The citizens of Davy's Bend feared that the sun had been drowned by the flood in the heavens, as the people were being drowned by the flood in the bottoms, for its kindly face had not appeared in 2 weeks. The roads and lanes in the country, highways no longer, were abandoned to the rain and the mist, for no travelers ventured upon them, and if the town had been dull before, it was now doubly so, giving the people abundance of time in which to recount their miseries. Men who ventured out in wagons told wonderful tales on their return of the reign of the waters, for insignificant streams which had long been regarded with familiar contempt had become dangerous rivers, roaring and crashing through fruitful fields in mad haste to join the floods. Great lakes occupied the low places for so many days that the people feared the land itself had floated away, leaving caverns in the place of their fields, and there was distress in the country as well as in the town. Rude boats to ply upon the newly arrived waters were hastily constructed by men who did not know how to use them, never having lived near a navigable stream, but there seemed a chance for them to learn, for the waters increased steadily every hour. As they lay in their beds at night, if they wakened and found that the rain had ceased, the people of the town hoped that the end had come at last, and that the waters would soon subside. But before they had framed their congratulations, the gentle patter of the rain was heard on their roofs once more, which continued through the long night, ceasing only occasionally, that the cries of distress and the alarms from the bottom might be heard, whereupon the rain commenced again with joyful vigor, sure that its fury was not without result. The rocky hills above and below the town were oozy and wet, and those who roamed about heard great splashes in the water, and knew that portions of the bluff were tumbling into the river, as if tired of being steady and reliable while everything else was falling, and anxious to join the tide and aid in the general destruction, as well as to get away from a place which seemed so unfortunate. The mild river, patient and uncomplaining so long, was master now, and it roared like a monster proud of its conquest, and declaring its intention to be wicked and fierce forever. The observers could not understand, so great was the awful flood, how the waters could ever subside, for surely all the lower country must have been flooded days before, and even those who lived in the hills were filled with grave apprehensions. Every morning the simple registers, which the people put up along the creeks and sloughs, showed an alarming rise, and they feared that if the rain continued, the earth itself would become liquid at last, and resolve itself into a vast sea without shores. No one knew how the news came, but there seemed to be whispers in the air that in the upper country the flood was even worse than at Davy's Bend, which added to the general apprehension, and many believed that the rainbow was about to prove faithless at last. Houses of a pattern barely familiar to the people occasionally floated past the town in the current, and in one of them rode a man who refused to leave his property when the relief boats put off to him, for he said that he came from hundreds of miles above, and that since the world seemed to be turning into water, he preferred his strange craft to the crumbling hills. As he floated away, stark mad from excitement, fear, and hunger, he called back to the men to follow if they valued their lives, for a wave 20 feet high was coming down the river, carrying the towns along the bluffs with it. Bridges which had been built across gullies in the highlands were seen hurrying by every hour, and it seemed that the hill on which Davy's Bend was built would shortly tremble, and start slowly down the river, at last gratifying the ambition of the people to get away. Among those distressed by the unfortunate condition of those living in the bottoms were Allan Dorris and his wife, safe in their home above the town. The people seemed so fearful that the rain would never cease that they neglected to get sick, and Dr. Dorris would have greatly enjoyed the uninterrupted days he was permitted to spend with his pretty wife but for the distress around him. The dripping from the eaves of the locks at night, he thought of it again, reminded him of the dripping from the coffin of a body packed in ice, which he was commissioned to watch, and long before day he left his bed and walked the floor. His wife soon joined him, and they looked out of the window at the blank darkness. "How it reminds me of the first night I came here," he said. "But what a different man I am! Then I cursed my existence, and was so disturbed in mind that night was a season of terror. I dreaded its approach as heartily then as I now hail it as a season of repose, and every day I have new reason to rejoice that I am alive. What a fortunate fellow I am! I can sleep 9 hours out of every night, and arise every morning entirely refreshed, not a day older. I am content now to lie down at night and let the world wag, or quarrel, or do whatever it likes, for the only part of it I care for is beside me. Sometimes I waken, and forget you for a moment, when I wonder how I ever induced such sound sleep to come to my eyes. But when I remember it all, I feel like cheering, and go off into dreamland again with the comfort of a heavy child. It is a wonderful change, and you are responsible for it all. You have made one man entirely happy, if you have accomplished nothing else." As they stood by the window, he had his arms around her, and when she looked up at him, he kissed her tenderly on the forehead. "Our marriage has brought no more happiness to you than it has to me," she answered. "Since you became my husband, I have known only content and gladness, except when I become childish and fear you are surrounded by some grave danger. If I could charge you with a wish, I could think of nothing to ask." "Who would harm me? Who would dare?" he asked. His wife thought to herself, as she looked at him, that it would be a dangerous undertaking to attempt to do him an injury. There were few men his equal in physical strength, and he could hold her out at arm's length. "Danger is a game that two can play at," he said, and there was a frown on his face so fierce as to indicate that someone who was his enemy had come into his mind. "I have seen the day when I would have allowed almost anyone the privilege of taking my life, if it would have afforded them pleasure. But let them keep out of my way now. The tiger fighting for her whelps would not be fiercer than I, if attacked. I have more to live for than any other man in the world, and I would fight, not only with desperation, but with skill and wickedness. If anyone wants my life, let him see that he does not lose his own in attempting to take it." Allan Dorris had been oppressed with a vague fear ever since his marriage that his long period of rest meant a calamity at last, though he had always tried to argue the notion out of his wife's mind. He had often felt that he was watched, though he had seen nothing, heard nothing, to warrant this belief. He could not explain it to himself, but frequently while walking about the town he turned his head in quick alarm and looked about as if expecting an attack. Once he felt so ill at ease at night, so thoroughly convinced that something was wrong, that he left his wife quietly sleeping, and crawled under the trees in the Locke's yard for an hour, with a loaded pistol in his hand. But he had seen nothing, heard nothing, and his own actions were so much like the presence he half expected to find, that he was ashamed of them and laughed at his fears. But the dark night and the cheerless rain brought the old dread into his mind, and he said to his wife, "We are all surrounded by danger, though I am as exempt from it as other men, but if I should meet with an accident some time, I take many long rides at night, and I have often been in places when a single misstep of my horse would have resulted in death. I want you to know that your husband was an honorable man. I have my faults, and I have regrets, but as the world goes, I am an honest man. Your love for me, which is as pure and good as it can be, has had as much warrant as other wives have for their love. It was never intended that a perfect man or woman should exist on this earth as a reproach to all other inhabitants, and I have my faults, but I have as clear a conscience as it was intended that the average man should have." "I am sure of that," his wife answered. "You always impress me as being a fair man, and this was one reason why I forget myself in loving you. I did not believe you would be unjust to anyone, surely not to one you loved." "I believe I am entitled to the compliment you pay me," he replied. "I know myself so well that a compliment which I do not deserve does not please me, but I deserve the good opinion you have just expressed. I have known people whose inclinations were usually right, but mine were usually wrong. Either that, or I have been so situated that, by reason of hasty conclusions, duty has always been a task. But notwithstanding this, I have always tried to be honest and fair in everything. It sometimes happens that a man is so situated that if he would be just to himself, he must be unjust to others. I may have been in that situation, and there may be those who believe that I have wronged them, but I am sure that an honest judge would acquit me of blame. I have often wanted to tell you my brief and unimportant history, but you have preferred not to hear it. While I admire you for this exhibition of trust in me, I have often wondered that your woman's curiosity did not covet the secret." "It is not a secret, since you offer to tell it to me," she replied. "But I prefer not to know it now. You once said to me that every life has its sorrows. Mine is the belief that I know what your history is, but I prefer to hope that I am wrong rather than know my conjecture is right." He looked at her with incredulity, and was about to inquire what she knew, when she continued, "You never speak to me that I do not get a scrap of your past history. I read you as easily as I read a book. But I knew it when I became your wife, and I think less of it now than ever. You are so kind to me that I think I shall forget it altogether in time. It is scarcely a sorrow, rather a regret, as I regret during my present happy life that I am growing old. Sometimes I think I love you all the more because of your misfortune, though I never think of it when I am with you. It is only when I am alone that it occupies my mind." "You are sure that you have not made it worse than it is?" "Quite sure." "Who was in the right?" "You were." "That much is true, anyway," he answered, looking out at the torrent in the river, which the approaching daylight now made visible. "I formerly had a habit of talking in my sleep. You may have learned something in that way." "A great deal," she replied. "I learned your name." For the first time since she had known him he seemed confused, and there was a flush of mortification in his face. He picked up a scrap of paper and pencil which were lying on a table near them, and handing them to her, said, "Write it." Without the slightest hesitation, she wrote quickly on the paper, and handed it back to him. He looked at it with a queer smile, tore up the scrap, and said, "That would have come out of the story you refused to hear. I have never deceived you in anything." "Except in this," she answered, putting her arms around him. "You are a much better man than I believed you were when we were first acquainted. You have deceived me in that. My married life could not be happier than it is. I do not take much credit to myself that we are content as husband and wife," he replied. "I think the fact that we are mated has a great deal to do with it. There are a great many worthy people, for the world is full of good women, if not good men, who live in the greatest wretchedness, who are as unhappy in their married relations as we are happy. I have known excellent men married to excellent wives, who are wretched, as I have known two excellent men to fail as partners in business. You and I were fortunate in our alliance. It often occurs to me that Mrs. Armsby should have had a better husband, poor woman. How many brave, capable men there are in this world who would rejoice in the possession of such a wife! Worthy, honest men who made a mistake only in marrying the wrong woman, and who will die believing there is nothing in the world worth living for, as I believed before I met you. Everyone who is out in the world a great deal knows such men, and pities them, as I do. For when I contrast my past with my present, I regret that others, more deserving than I, cannot enjoy the contentment which love brings. You and I are not phenomenal people in any respect, but we are man and wife in the fullest sense of the term, and others might enjoy the peace we enjoy were they equally fortunate in their love affairs. It is a grand old world for you and I, and those like us, but it is a hell for those who have been coaxed into unsuitable marriages by the devil. There is as much bitterness in your voice now as there was when you said to me in the church that you were going away, never to come back," his wife said, looking at him with keen apprehension. "I am a different man now to what I was then," he replied with his old good nature. "Have you never remarked it?" "Often, every time I hear you speak. I find that there are splendid people even in Davy's Bend, and I imagine that when the mind is not tortured they may be found anywhere. In my visits to the homes of Davy's Bend, I hear it said in every quarter that surely the neighbors are the best people in the world, and their kindness in sickness and death cause me to believe that as a rule the people are very good, unless you chain two antagonistic spirits together and demand that they be content. I know so much of the weakness of my race, because it happens to be my business, that I wonder they are as industrious and honorable as I find them. This never occurred to me before, and I think it is evidence that I am a changed man, that I am more charitable than I ever was before, and better." They both looked out the window in silence again. A misty morning, threatening rain, and the river before them like a sea. "I must do something to help those who were imprisoned in their homes by the flood," Allan Dorris said, as if a sight of the river had suggested it to him. "I will go down where boats are to be had presently, and row over into the timber. Do you see that line of trees?" Below the town, in the river bend, a long line of trees made out into the channel, which were on dry land in ordinary times, but the point was covered now, for the flood occupied the bottom from bluff to bluff. He pointed this out, and when his wife saw the place he referred to, she nodded her head. "My boat will be carried down the stream by the strong current, and I will probably enter the timber there. I will wave my good-bye to you from that point." He went out soon after to prepare for the trip, and during his absence his wife hurriedly prepared his breakfast, and when he came back he wore coat and boots of rubber. "What a wonderful housekeeper you are!" he said as he sat down to the table. "No difference what I crave, you supply it before I have time to worry because of the lack of it. But it is so in everything. I never want to do a thing but that I find you are of the same mind. It is very easy to spoil a boy, but I think the girls are naturally so good that they turn out well without much attention. You had no mother to teach you, but you took charge of my house with as much good grace and ease as though you had been driven to it all your life. I think a great deal more of your sex because of my acquaintance with you. If my wife is not the most wonderful woman in the world, I shall never know it." "I am almost ashamed to say it after your kind remark," his wife replied, "but I am afraid I do not want you to go over into the bottoms. The thought of it fills me with dread, though I know you ought to go." "And why not?" he said cheerfully. "I may be able to rescue some unfortunate over there, and there is nothing dangerous in the journey. I shall return before the night comes on, no fear of that, but before I go I want to tell you again how much my marriage with you has done for me. I want you to keep it in your mind while I am away, that you may understand why I am glad to return. Until I came here and met you, I was as discontented as a man could possibly be, and I am very grateful to you. A life of toil and misery was my lot until you came to my rescue, and I thank you for your kindness to me. It occurred to me while I was out of the room just now that the shadow under the trees is very much like the shadow I intended to penetrate when you came to me that dark night and blessed me. Once you came into the room where I was lying down, after returning from the country, though I was not asleep as you supposed. The gentle manner in which you touched my forehead with your lips, that was love. I have thought about it 1,000 times since, and been thankful. The human body I despise, because of my familiarity with it. But such a love as yours is divine. I only regret that it is not more general. Love is the only thing in life worth having. If a man who lacks it is not discontented, he is like an idiot who is always laughing, not realizing his condition. Some people I have known suggested depravity by their general appearance. You think of your own faults from looking at them, and feel ashamed. But it makes me ambitious to look at you, and every day since I have known you, I have been a better man than I was the day before." He had finished his repast by this time, and they walked out to the front door together, arm in arm, like lovers. "I have heard it said," he continued as he tied up his rubber boots and made final preparations for starting, "that if a wife is too good to her husband, he will finally come to dislike her. You are too good to me, I suppose, but it never occurs to me to dislike you for it. On the contrary, it causes me to resolve to be worthy of your thoughtfulness. It will do me good to go into the shadow for a day. I will appreciate the sunshine all the more when I return. But if I should not return, if an accident should happen to me, which is always possible anywhere, my last thought would be thankfulness for the happiness of the past 3 months." "But you do not anticipate danger," she said, grasping his arm as if to lead him back into the house. "There is no danger," he replied. "Even if my boat should fail me, I could swim back to you from the farthest point, for I love you so much. You have never seen my reserve strength in action. If a possibility of being separated from you should present itself, I imagine I should greatly surprise my enemies. Never fear, I shall come back in good time. I believe that should I get killed, my body would float against the current and hug the bank at the point nearest the locks." He kissed her quickly and hurried away, and his form was soon lost in the bend of the street. How dark it was under the trees! The increasing dull daylight brightened everything save the darkness under the trees. Nothing could relieve that. What if he should go into it never to return, as he had intended the night they were married? No, no, no! She wrung her hands at that thought, and ran towards the door, as if intending to pursue him and bring him back before he could enter it. But Allan was strong and trusty, and he would come back to laugh at her childish fears as she took his dripping garments at the close of the day, and listened to an account of his adventures. No fear of that. A half-hour later she saw a boat with a single rower put out from the town, and make slow headway against the strong current to the other shore. Was he going alone? It was not dangerous. She persuaded herself of that, but she thought it must be very lonesome rowing about in such a flood, and he should not go out again, for he would do anything she wished, and she would ask it as a favor. Why had she neglected to think of this, and ask him to go with others. But it was too late now, for the rower soon reached the line of trees he had pointed out to her from the window, waved his white handkerchief, which looked like a signal of danger, and disappeared into the shadow. End of chapter 18. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 19 of The Mystery of the Locks by E.W. Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 19. Mr. Whittle Makes a Confession. The first rays of the bad morning, as it looked in at Mr. Whittle's window, found that worthy busily engaged in cleaning and scouring his gun. It was not yet his bedtime, for of late he spent all of every night, instead of part of it, in prowling about, bent on mischief, he said. But Silas Davy knew that Tug had a fierce desire to protect Allan Dorris, for whom he had taken such a strange fancy, from harm, and that night after night, whether the weather was good or bad, his friend kept watch around the locks, carrying his gun in readiness for instant use. Silas usually kept him company until he became sleepy, and knew that he must return in order to keep awake and attend to his work the next day. But Tug, who slept during the day, seldom deserted his post. He may have left his beat occasionally for an hour or two, but only to creep carefully up into the hills back of the house, where he crouched and listened beside the paths, and then crept back again. A good many times he walked down to the hotel, always choosing an hour when he knew Silas would be alone in the kitchen, on which occasions he never failed to take a shot with his eyes up the alleys and into all the dark places, but he did not remain long, so that almost every night, when Silas went to bed, he had the satisfaction of knowing that if the shadow should attempt to harm Allan Dorris, there would be an explosion loud enough to alarm the town. Silas, who had been out on the bottoms the day before, came in late in the evening, and, throwing himself on the bed, he slept so soundly that when Tug appeared, late in the morning, from one of his vagrant tramps, he was not aroused. And there he lay now, in his clothes, sound asleep, his face as innocent as a child's, as his mind was. As Tug scoured away on the gun, rubbing off the rust and dirt, he occasionally looked at Silas, and the thought no doubt occurred to him that if there ever was a thoroughly unselfish, incapable, kind-hearted fellow, there he was, on the bed, asleep, and resting well. "He'll soon be awake, though," Tug said aloud, looking up at the window, and noting the increasing light. "He can't sleep when it's light enough for him to work. He has been driven to it by his hard masters until he knows nothing else, and he has a habit of getting up at daylight which he can never overcome. Silas was ruined by too much work. I was ruined by too little of it, I suppose. Anyway, I'm ruined. Nobody disputes that. I am so ornery that I am becoming ashamed of myself." Mr. Whittle meditated a moment, and then, putting down his gun, he walked over to a piece of looking-glass, which was tacked against the wall, and took a long look at himself. The inspection was apparently unsatisfactory, for he shook his fist at the reflection, made a face at it, and muttered ill-humoredly as he walked back to his chair. "If Davy didn't forget so easy," Mr. Whittle said aloud again, rubbing away on the gun-barrel, "what a fine man he would be. If he could make money as easily as he is good-natured, he would be a fine fellow. But they say he works to no purpose, and must have somebody to watch him, though he means well. Everybody says that. If Davy should be told to turn a crank, he would do it better than anybody, and keep at it longer. But the men who make money not only work hard, but use judgment, and Davy lacks judgment, poor fellow. They all say that. If the hotel should catch a fire, he wouldn't put it out unless somebody told him to. He wouldn't think of it. But he means as well as any man in America. I can cheerfully say that for him. An ordinary man never opens his mouth without saying something mean. But if ever I heard Davy say a mean thing, or knew him to do a mean thing, may I become a preacher. Well, the talents must be divided, I suppose, for no person seems to combine any two of them. I know enough, but somebody else has the honesty, the industry, the decency, etc., which I lack. Unfortunately, it does not follow that a sensible man is a square man or a good man. I'd rather trust a fool for honesty than a man with a big head, any day. The worst crimes I have ever heard of were the work of men cursed with more brains than conscience. I thought he couldn't sleep long after the sun was up. Looking over at his sleeping partner, he saw that he was becoming uneasy, and soon he sat up on the edge of the bed and looked around in bewilderment as he rubbed his eyes. "Well, Rogue, how do you feel?" Tug inquired, stopping his scouring. "What time is it?" Davy inquired, with a show of excitement, and getting on his feet without answering the question. "I should say it was 5 o'clock Wednesday morning," Tug replied, looking out at the window, and then back at his companion, as if wondering at his nervousness. "Why?" "I meant to remain awake to tell you of it last night," Silas replied hurriedly, "but I was so tired, from rowing all day, that I dropped off to sleep soon after I came in. I have seen the shadow." Tug sprang up from the low chair in which he had been sitting, and began to nervously fumble through his pockets, as if looking for ammunition. "I was out in the bottoms with Armsby yesterday," Davy continued, "and twice we passed a man rowing about alone. We were not very close to him, but I am sure it was the shadow, and that he meant mischief. Each time when we encountered him he rowed away rapidly, and when Armsby hailed him he paid no attention." Tug was much concerned over this news, for after finding his ammunition he went to loading his gun with great vigor. "Could you see his short ear?" he stopped to inquire, after ramming down a great quantity of powder. "No, his left side was from me, but I am sure it was the same man. And I am sure that the boat in which he rowed was the same one you took the little woman out of. I hurried here as fast as I could to tell you, but when I lay down on the bed to wait for you, I fell asleep. Armsby made me row all day while he kept a lookout for ducks. I am sorry I fell asleep." Silas rubbed his sore arms and looked very meek, but Tug was too busy making arrangements to go out to notice him. "The impudence of the scoundrel!" he said as he poured in the shot. "I never thought to look for him in daylight. Which way did he go?" Tug peered into the tube of the gun with his big eye before capping it, as if expecting to find his enemy crouching down in the powder, but finding that the powder primed, he put on a cap and stood ready to go out. "Into the woods," Silas answered. "When we first met him he was rowing toward town, but on seeing us he turned the other way. That was about noon, and just before night we saw him again, coming toward town as before, but he pulled off to the right when he met us, and disappeared under the trees. I expected you in every moment when I fell asleep, or I would have gone up to the locks and told Allan Dorris. We ought to tell him about this man, Tug. His appearance here so regularly means trouble. Within a year we have seen him a dozen times, and each time he has been lurking around Allan Dorris. We really ought to do something." In the emergency Silas did what he had done 100 times in other emergencies. He said that something should be done, and folded his hands. "Ain't I tryin' to do something?" his companion answered testily. "Haven't I tried my best to shoot him? What more can I do? But he has only been here 7 times. Here is the record." He handed the gun over to Silas, who saw for the first time that there were 7 notches cut in the stock, the particularly long one representing the time that Tug had shot at the shadow and missed. The men had talked of warning Dorris a great many times before, but Tug had always argued that it was unnecessary, that it would only render him nervous and suspicious, whereas he was now contented, and very useful to the townspeople and his young wife. Silas had always been in favor of putting his friend on his guard against an enemy who seemed to come and go with the night, but Tug had stubbornly held out against it, and perhaps this was the reason he guarded The Locks so faithfully. Sometimes he would only hear a noise in the underbrush, at other times he saw a crouching figure, but before deciding to fire at it, it would disappear, but there was always something to convince him that his old enemy was still occasionally lurking about the town. A few times he had seen him openly, as has been narrated, but there was always something in the way of the accomplishment of the purpose nearest his heart, the only purpose of his life. He did not know himself why he had taken such an interest in Dorris, nor had he ever attempted to explain it to Silas, but he admired the man, and the only ambition he had ever acknowledged was connected with the safety of the person he admired, according to his own confession, next to rum and devilishness, for not even Davy outranked the owner of The Locks in Tug's callous heart. And Dorris himself was not more pleased when his wife was praised than was the rusty old lawyer, and at her suggestion he had worked whenever he could get to it during the winter which had just passed, at copying, drawing legal papers, and at keeping books, for he was competent at any of these occupations. It is probable that had she asked him to go to work as a day laborer he would have consented, for she was kind to him in a great many ways, and often invited him to visit The Locks, when he appeared looking very much like a scarecrow, the result of his attempts at fixing up, and using his great eye, after arriving, to look around for refreshments, for he was always hungry. Being a noted character, when it became known that he had reformed, and that he was patronized by the Dorrises, a great many others took pains to patronize him, and gave him work of the kind he was willing to do, for he was still very particular in this respect. When at The Locks, if he threatened to drink too much, Mrs. Dorris took his glass and kept it, although her husband was usually in favor of turning him on, as Tug expressed it, for he was very amusing when a little tipsy, and kept them in continued laughter by his dignified oddity. "I will tell him to-day," Tug said, taking the gun into his own hands again. "He must not go into the bottoms unless accompanied by a party, and as he hasn't been over yet, he may take it into his head to go to-day. I will tell him in an hour. He won't be up before that time." "Do you know, Tug," Silas said, "what I think of you?" "Well, out with it. Let's have it." "I think you are a better man than you pretend." "It's a lie," his companion replied fiercely, hitting the table a hard blow with his clenched fist. "It's a lie." "I have often thought it was very much to your credit that you took such an interest in a hunted man," Davy said, "who is shadowed by a cowardly enemy, but perhaps I am mistaken. I usually am. It's not important." Tug hung his head in mortification at this suggestion, and for once in his life neglected to be indifferent and dignified at the same time, which was possible with him, if with no one else. "Whoever accuses me of being a good man," he said finally, "wrongs me. When I made the discovery, a good many years ago, that I could never hope to become anything, I made up my mind to distinguish myself for shiftlessness. I despise a common man, therefore I am an uncommonly proficient loafer. I am better known in this town than some of your respectable men, and I don't have to work so hard. There are men here, and plenty of them, who have worked all their lives, and who have no more than I have, which is nothing. They expect that there is a great deal in the future for them, but I have sense enough to know there is nothing very great in the future for any of us, therefore I live as my fancy dictates. I am a natural-born vagrant. Most of us are, but most of us do not say so. I despise 5-cent respectability, therefore I am a $1 vagrant, and will pass for that anywhere. I had enough of good people when I was married to one of them. My wife was a good woman." "I hope I haven't offended you," the meek little man said, looking at his fierce companion in alarm. "I didn't mean any disrespect." "Oh, you needn't take it back," Tug retorted. "You've gone too far. It's all right. But let me tell you the truth for once in my life. I believe I never did before. I expect it will set me to coughing, but I will try it. My wife hasn't a relative in the world that I know of. Certainly I never met any of them. The only objection I have to her is that she is good. She is so good that she is a bore. Goodness is a fault, and a grave one with her. She couldn't possibly be more disagreeable than she is, and her fault is, she is good. When there is a dry spell, she wants to get up a rain, and whether it rains or not, you are expected to give her credit for philanthropy. When it is too cold, she moans about the poor people who are suffering, and those who are around her must accept this as noble, or be called wicked, or heartless, or something else. She even has a good way of gossiping about people, and I despise her for no other reason than that she is good. I can't tolerate her. She makes my feet cold." Tug had uttered the word "good" in each instance like an oath, and Davy cowered under his cold stare as though fearing he might be good, and was about to be accused of it. "Everything she does is right. Everything you do is wrong. There you have the old women in a mouthful," the outraged husband continued. "She is always jumping on you for not being good, and for your refusal to see goodness in her, and no one around her sees a moment's peace, for she badgers them to death for their neglect to rid the earth of sin, or some other trifling matter like that. She neglects herself in the most shameful manner to moan about rampant rum, or the vitality of vice, for I never saw her ears clean, and if ever you find her with clean fingernails, look out for the pigs, for they will fly. If she is a good woman, then hurrah for the devil. The fat, the lean, the long, the short, the ugly, they go into the good business. For I never knew anyone who could attract attention in the ordinary way to engage in it, and when a woman becomes too fat for society, or too plain to be admired, she goes to yelling that she is better than anybody else, and wants everybody to behave, although they may be behaving all right already. The good-looking and amiable ones remain at home, where they belong, and I admire them for it. Had I been a rich man, the old women would have remained with me, and called that good, But since I was a friendless devil and a worthless vagabond, she left me, and called that good. I hope she is the only woman of that kind in the world. Look how she treats little Ben. Does she act like a mother toward him? Don't I have to take all the care of him, and look after him, and attend to his bringing up? Is it common for mothers to neglect their own ragged children, and weep over fat and contented people? That's what she does. Therefore, if you are a friend of mine, don't call me good." Silas was not taking as much interest in the recital as he would have done under other circumstances, for he was thinking of Allan Dorris, but Tug was determined to talk about the old women. "When we were first married," he continued, "I told her some sort of a lie about myself, a simple sort of a yarn about nothing, and only intended to earn cheap glory for myself. In some way she found me out, for she is always poking her nose around smelling for sin, and until I could stand it no longer and finally left her, she was continually asking me for additional particulars of the fictitious incident I had related. I say she found me out. I don't know it, but I always believed she did, and that she only asked these questions to hear me lie, and gloat over her own virtue. The story I told her was about saving a man's life, and as he afterwards came to Davy's Bend and knew the old women, I felt sure that she had found me out. After that she asked me 1,000 questions about it, and every time I invented a new lie to go with the first one. Did she do this because she was good? You bet she didn't. She did it to convince herself that she was good, and that I was bad. But I tell you that, average me up, I am as good as she is, and I am perfectly worthless." Picking up a rickety chair which stood near him, Mr. Whittle smashed it to pieces on the floor, after a tremendous pounding and racket, which was one of his ways of expressing anger. Silas was very much impressed by this ferocious proceeding, and looked on in meek astonishment until his companion was seated again. "Isn't it time for you to go to The Locks?" he asked. "Sure enough," Tug said. "I'm going up there this morning. I'll go now." Without further words he picked up his gun and started out, going over the hills to avoid the frequented streets. He had made up his mind to make a full breast of the story, so he walked along leisurely, thinking that he had a genuine surprise in store for his friend. Arriving at the Locks gate, he blew the whistle, which was always looking out into Dorris's room like an eye, and waited for an answer. It came soon after, the cheerful voice of Annie Dorris, inquiring what was wanted. "It's me, Tug," he answered. "I want to see Mr. Dorris." "He left an hour ago to go over into the Bottoms," was the reply. "Anything urgent?" "Oh, no," the man replied, as he swallowed a great lump which came up into his throat. "Nothing urgent. I only wanted him to pull a tooth." With long strides at first, Tug started for the river, but after he was out of sight from the Locks, he ran like a man pursued, and arriving at the place where the ferry was tied up, making steam for the day's work, he seized the first boat within his reach and pushed off into the stream. The owner of it called to him to come back, as he wanted the boat himself, but Tug paid no attention, except to row the harder, and soon disappeared under the trees. End of chapter 19. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 20 of The Mystery of the Locks, by E.W. Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 20. The Search in the Woods. From noon until twilight Annie Dorris watched the point on the other shore of the river, where her husband had promised to wave the signal of his return long before nightfall, but nothing did she see save the floating debris of the flood, which looked like tired travelers hurrying forward to find a night's shelter. Great trees came floating down, with their arms outstretched as if for help, and occasionally these disappeared in the angry water, as human floaters might disappear after giving up in despair, believing it to be impossible to reach the shore. Boats carrying parties of men came back one by one to the town as the afternoon wore away, and the ferry came in later in the evening, panting like a thing of life after its hard day's work. But no boat with a single strong rower appeared to cheer the gaze of the faithful watcher. Everything seemed to be hurrying away from her and from Davy's Bend, and from the gathering darkness under the trees, save the returning boats, and she thought their occupants appeared to be anxious to reach their own homes and tell of some horror in the woods. Perhaps some of the rowers had a message to be delivered at the locks, and when they did not come, the fear found its way to her throbbing heart that the news was dreadful, and that they delayed until they could muster up more courage. While it was yet light on the water, an ugly nightshade collected under the trees where her husband's boat had disappeared, reaching out with long arms to capture those in the boats, who were hurrying away from it. A black monster, it seemed, fat with prey, watching the town with stealthy care until its people were sleeping after the day's work and unsuspicious of attack. As Annie Dorris watched this black shadow grow larger and larger and become so bold as to approach still nearer to the town, it seemed to her that no one within it could ever escape, and though an occasional boat did come out, it hurried toward the town rapidly, as if in fright, and this encouraged her to hope that her husband had been delayed in some way, and would safely return with wonderful adventures to relate. So she kept up the vigil and saw the shadow grow blacker as the afternoon became night. When it was too dark to see even the river, Annie Dorris stood looking out into the night, hoping that her husband had returned another way, and that his footstep would soon be heard on the stair, for she could think of no danger that could befall him, since rowing in the flood was safe, in spite of the strong current. Once she heard a light step on the stair, and she was sure that it was her husband coming up to surprise her, and there was a pause of long duration on the landing. But when she threw open the door in joyful expectation, the quiet darkness looked at her in pity. More than once the footstep on the stair was heard by the anxious and terrified wife, and more than once she hurried to the door to look into the hall. But hope seemed to be leaving the house, and she imagined she heard it in the lower hall, hurrying away. Returning to the window, she saw such fearful phantoms in the darkness that she ran, bareheaded, into the street and up the hill to her father's house. "Annie!" Thompson Benton said, as she ran into his room with starting eyes and disheveled hair. "Annie, what has happened?" "Oh, father," she replied, bursting into tears, "my husband has not returned from the Bottoms." Thompson Benton had been expecting a calamity to befall Allan Dorris, for while he had grown to honestly admire him, there was always something in his manner which indicated that he was in danger. Perhaps this suspicious dread grew out of the keen relish with which Allan Dorris enjoyed his home, as if every day were to be his last. It may have been the result of the general belief that he remained in the town to hide away from malicious enemies, or knowledge of the pathetic sadness which always distinguished his manner. But, whatever it was, Thompson Benton put on his coat and boots, which he had just taken off, precisely as a man might do who had been summoned on a long-expected errand. He had no explanations of the absence to offer to the weeping wife, but became grave at once, and made his preparations to go out in nervous haste. So, without speaking an encouraging word to his daughter, who had sunk down on her knees beside her father's chair, he left the house and hurried down to the town. With long strides he reached the river's brink, where a number of boats were tied, and spoke to a few trusty men who were there, some of whom at once put oars into two of the boats, while others hurried back into the town after lanterns and torches. While they were gone, Thompson Benton walked up and down the bank, pausing frequently to look toward the woods, but he said nothing, and paid no attention to those who looked at him curiously for an explanation. For the absence of this grim old man from his home at night was important. It was particularly important now, since it was known that he was only waiting for the return of the men with the torches to go over into the bottoms. The news spread rapidly that something unusual was in the air, and when the two boats, rowed by 4 men each, pushed out into the stream, half of the town was left on the bank to talk of their mission in low whispers, and hope that Allan Dorris would be found safe and well. Among those who watched the lights in the boats as they were rowed away and finally disappeared under the trees was Silas Davy, who felt that his neglect to warn Allan Dorris of the shadow which followed him so persistently had resulted in a tragedy at last. The departure of the men at that hour to look for him, and the preparations they had made for the search, were dreadfully significant. There could be no mistake of that, and Silas wandered along the shore for an hour, hoping to see the boats return and hear the men talking cheerfully on the water, indicating that his friend had been found. But the longer he watched the woods, the darker they became, and the less prospect there seemed to be that the lights the men had carried would never reappear, so he resolved to walk up to The Locks, hoping to find Dorris there, and be the first to give the news to the town. But at the gate he met Mrs. Wedge, who anxiously asked him for information of the missing man. There was nothing cheerful in her pale, anxious face, nor in the stillness which hung about the place like a pall. Silas was compelled to acknowledge that there was so little hope in the town that he had come there for encouragement. He then told her in a whisper of the departure of the men in the boats, and of their carrying lanterns and torches, but Mrs. Wedge did not give him the encouragement he expected, for she put her hands to her face, and Silas was certain that she was crying. When she had recovered her composure, she motioned the little man to follow her, and they walked together up the broad walk and up the stone steps until they entered the door. There were no lights in the house, and the great mass of stone seemed to be a part of the darkness from the woods. When they were on the inside, Mrs. Wedge carefully closed the door and said to him softly, "Listen." A timid step on the stair, going up and coming down in unceasing monotony. Occasionally it stopped on going up, as if it were of no use to look again; on coming down, as if fearing some corner had been overlooked in the search, but it soon went on again, up and down the stair, into the room which was sacred to the empty cradle, and out of it again, the step on the stair which always gave warning of trouble. Once it came so near to them that Silas half expected, as he stood trembling in the darkness, that the ghost of poor Helen would lay hands on him, and inquire in pitiful tones for the little girl who seemed to be lost in the house. But it passed by, and wearily ascended the stairs, only to come wearily down again after a short absence in the room where the light and the life had gone out. Mrs. Wedge led Silas back to the gate, and, after crying softly to herself a while, said to him in a voice so agitated that he could scarcely understand her, "It has not been heard before since they were married. I had hoped that poor Helen had found rest at last, but her footstep on the stair this night means—I won't say the word. It might be carried by some evil spirit to his wife. The poor girl is at her father's, and I am afraid to look at her. Oh, Annie, Annie!" Meanwhile the boats pursued their journey into the woods, a man in the bow of each with a torch to direct the rowers. The underbrush was submerged, and they made fair progress toward the line of hills opposite the town, though they drifted about a good deal, for sometimes they were in doubt as to their bearings, as there was nothing to guide them. Occasionally they stopped to listen, hoping that Dorris had disabled his boat and was safe in some of the trees. But, hearing nothing, they hallooed themselves, each one taking his turn until they were all hoarse. But the rippling water laughed with joy because their voices sounded dead in the forest lake, and seemed afraid to venture out into the damp, noisome darkness. Finding a place where the current was not so strong, they pulled to a point which they believed to be above the town, calling, "Hello! Hello!" at every boat's length. But the devilish gurgle in the water continued, and their voices came back to them, like hounds ordered to enter a dangerous lair. Occasionally a waterfowl resting for the night was disturbed, and went crashing through the branches of the trees. But no other sound came to them, and as the hours wore away they looked at each other in grave apprehension. A few times, in the middle of clearings, they came upon deserted houses, with vagrant water pouring in at the windows, only to creep out at other windows after making a search in the rooms for lives to destroy. But most of the people had escaped to the hills with their farm animals, leaving their household effects to be covered with the reptiles which had been frightened out of the thickets and tall grass, and which clung to whatever offered them safety. Under the trees they frequently found drifts composed of household furniture, bridges, fences, outhouses, logs, stumps, and what not, and the desolation which reigned supreme in that dark, damp place was relieved but little by the glare of the torches, which made the men look like pale-faced spirits rowing about in an eternal effort to escape. If the men wearied in the search, a look at the earnest, gray-haired old man in the largest boat, who was always straining his eyes in attempting to penetrate the darkness, revived them, and they floated on, pulling to the right or to the left, as Thompson Benton directed, and crying, "Hello! Hello!" in tones which sounded plaintive and sad and hopeless. Always an earnest man, Thompson Benton had never before been as earnest as he was this night, and he had called "Hello! Hello!" so frequently that when he spoke it was either in a hoarse voice or in a soft whisper. At the lower point of the bend in the hills which gave the town its name, a sluggish lake was found, the main current striking diagonally across the river to shorten the distance in its hurry to do mischief below, and the boats found their way into this. While floating around not far from the base of the hills, those who were in the smaller boat suddenly came upon a gravestone, the top of which was only a foot out of water. "We are floating over Hedgepath graveyard," the man who was in front carrying the torch said to the others. The stone which had attracted his attention seemed to be taller than the others, for it was the only one appearing above the surface. The water covered everything except this rounded piece of stone, which alone remained to mark the resting place of the dead, providing the dead had not been seized with the universal desire for floating off and gone away to visit graveyards in the lower country. He caught hold of the stone to steady the boat, and throwing his light upon the other side of it, read, "Sacred to the memory of—" The name in whose honor the slab had been raised was below the water, and the man put his hand down into it to read as a blind man reads raised letters. "The first letter is A," he said, rubbing the face of the stone with his fingers, "like the alphabet, and the next is L." The fellow continued rubbing the face of the stone with the tips of his fingers, while his lips moved as he tried letter after letter and gave them up. "Hello, another L," he said in surprise at last, drawing up his hand hurriedly on making the discovery, and shaking it violently to throw off the water, but there remained on his wrist a sickening scum, which he hurriedly transferred to the side of the boat. "I'll read no further," he said with a frightened look. "I'm afraid it will turn out to be Allen, with a space and a big D following it." The torch-bearer still held on to the stone while the rowers rested, but the other boat, in which Thompson Benton sat, was busy a short distance beyond them, from one clump of debris to another, as if he only hoped now to find the lifeless body of the one he sought. "Strange people are buried here," the torch-bearer said, speaking softly to his panting companions, while they rested from their hard work. "Suicides, and those who have died violent deaths. Hedgepath is devoted to them. I've heard it said that this is a rough neighborhood, but the best of their dead are put away further up the hill. If the flood has not drowned out the ghosts, we will see one tonight." The suggestion of ghosts was not a pleasant one to the rowers, particularly to those who were farthest from the torch, for they looked timidly about as though they were likely to be approached from behind by spirits riding on headstones. "There is a road running along the edge of Hedgepath, leading from the ferry into the hills," the torch-bearer said, who was the bravest of the lot because he was directly under the light, "and those who have traveled it at night say that the inhabitants of this place sit on stumps beside the road and want to argue with the passers-by. One fellow who was hanged, he has a great deal to say about the perjured witnesses. And another who was accused of poisoning himself, he says he found it in his coffee, though he does not tell who put it there. And so many others have horrible stories to tell that travelers usually hurry by this place as fast as they can." It was not a cheerful subject, but his companions listened with close attention, occasionally casting glances behind them. "The unknown people who are found floating in the river, they are buried here, and those who travel the Hedgepath road at night say these offer them letters, and ask that they be posted. I have forgotten who it was, but somebody told me that he received one of these letters in his own hand and mailed it, and that soon after one of the bodies was taken up by friends from a distance and carried away." The grim joker was interrupted by a hail from the other boat, and the men dipped their oars into the water and pulled toward it. Thompson Benton and those who were with him were looking with eager eyes at a boat which was floating a short distance beyond them, within the rays of their torch, and which was rising and falling with the ripples, with both oars hanging helplessly out in the water. The men were waiting in fear for their companions to come up to keep them company before approaching it, and when the two boats were side by side they were held together, and the outside oars of each were used to row toward the deserted craft, as a party of men who discover a suspicious object in a strange locality might move toward it together. As they drew nearer, the form of a prostrate man was seen. "Dismiss thy husband into the shadows from whence he came, O pretty wife, for he is murdered." In the bottom of the boat, lying easily on his back, the rowers found Allan Dorris, dead, his eyes closed as if in disturbed sleep, and his face upturned to the heavens. His right hand was gripped on the side of the boat, as if his last wish had been to pull himself into a sitting posture, and look toward the town where his faithful wife was watching for his return. The flash of the torches made the face look ghastly and white, and there was a stain of blood on his lips. Those who looked upon the face saw in it an expression of regret to die, which remained with them as long as they lived. They spoke of it tenderly to their children, who grew up and gave their own children descriptions of Allan Dorris's pitiful face as he lay dead in his boat on the night when the waters of the great flood began to recede. It is said that the face of a sorrowing man looks peaceful in death. It may be equally true that death stamps unmistakable regret on the face of its victim who is not ready. Oh, pitiless death, you might have spared this man, who was just beginning, and taken one of the mourning thousands who watch for you through the night, and are sad because of your long delay. This man desired so much to live that his white face seems to say now, "I cannot die. I dread it. Oh, how terrible it would be to die now!" And his eyes are wet with tears, a touching monument of his dread of thee. The rough men reverently uncovered their heads as Thompson Benton looked at the dead man in stupefaction, but when he had recovered he lifted the body gently up and made a hasty examination. Laying it down again, he looked at the men and said in a tone which indicated that he had long expected it, "Shot in the back." Lashing their boats together, the rowers gulled back to town without speaking a word. That containing the body of Allan Dorris towing behind, the pathetic face looking up to heaven, as if asking forgiveness. The stars came out as the rowers pursued their journey back to the town, and the storm was over. Peace to the pathetic dust. In the town on the hill, where the twinkling lights mingle with the stars, waits a weeping woman who knew Allan Dorris well. Let her opinion of the dead prevail, and not that of the gossiping winds which have been whispering into the ears of the people. End of chapter 20. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 21 of The Mystery of the Locks by E.W. Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 21 Little Ben. In answer to a note requesting his presence at the Locks, Silas Davy hurried towards that part of the town as soon as he found relief from his duties at the hotel, regretting as he went along that Mr. Whittle was not ahead of him with his gun, for late events had not been of a cheerful nature, and he felt the need of better company than little Ben, who dragged his weary frame into the hotel kitchen a few minutes before Silas started. Not that Silas did not love the boy, nor had he any objection to his company on this errand, but with cries of murder in the air and the reports of guns, he thought he would have preferred a stouter companion in his walk. But as they hurried along, little Ben keeping up with difficulty, Silas thought that perhaps the boy's mild goodness would keep away evil, and protect them both. It occurred to him for the first time that in a storm of thunder and lightning he should like to keep close to little Ben, for though mankind might be unjust to him, the monsters of strength would pity his weakness, and strike elsewhere. Therefore Silas came to feel quite content in his company. Of the shot in the bottoms which had created so much excitement in Davy's Bend, and of the drifting boat which had been found in the flood by Thompson Benton and his men, Silas knew nothing, except as he heard these matters discussed about the hotel. Although the people went to the Locks in crowds the day after the body was found, and remained there from early in the morning until late at night, every new arrival being taken into one of the darkened lower rooms to look at the dead man, Silas was not of the number. He was afraid to look at his friend's face, fearing he could see in it an accusation of his neglect to give warning of the shadow, so he remained away, and went about his duties in a dreamy way, starting at every sound, as though he feared that the people had at last found out his guilt and had come to accuse him for not notifying them of the danger of which he had been aware. The receipt of the note had frightened him too, and he felt sure that when he entered the presence of Annie Dorris, she would break down, and inquire why he had robbed her of a husband in his usual thoughtless way. Perhaps the sight of little Ben, in his weakness and goodness, would plead for him. So he picked the child up and carried him on the way as far as his own weak arms would permit. Mrs. Wedge soon appeared in answer to his ring at the Locks' gate, and admitted him into the hall where he had heard the steps on the stair on the night when there was alarm because of Dorris's absence in the bottoms. It was dark in the hall now, as it was then, and while Silas waited for Mrs. Wedge to fasten the door at which they had entered, he listened eagerly for the footsteps, and when he did not hear them, he trembled at the sound of his own as he finally went up the stairs behind Mrs. Wedge, followed by little Ben. Going up to the door leading into the room which had been occupied by his friend, Silas was ushered into the presence of Annie Dorris, who was seated near the window where the shadow had twice appeared. There was a great change in her manner, he noticed at once. The pretty face, which had formerly always carried the suspicion of a laugh, was now distinguished by a settled grief, and it was pale and haggard. Her pale face was in sharp contrast to the dress of mournful black, and the good fellow who was always trying to do right, but who was always in doubt as to which was right and which was wrong, would have given his life cheerfully to have been a month younger. While Silas stood near the doorway, changing his hat from one hand to the other in confusion, he noticed that tears started to her eyes. "Please don't cry," Silas said, walking towards her. "I want to tell you the guilty part I have taken in this dreadful affair, but I cannot muster up the courage when there are tears in your eyes. Please don't cry." Annie Dorris bravely wiped her tears away at this request, and looked at Silas with a face indicating that if his presence had opened her wounds afresh, she would try and conceal it. "I am oppressed with the fear that I am to blame for this," he continued in desperate haste, "and I must tell you and get it off my mind, even though you send for the sheriff and have me arrested. I cannot contain the secret any longer, now that I am in your presence." Little Ben had crawled into a chair on entering the room, and was already fast asleep, with his head hanging on his breast, dreaming, let us hope, of kind treatment, and of a pleasant home. "Within a month after Allan Dorris came to Davy's Bend," Silas said, seating himself near Mrs. Dorris, "Tug and I discovered that he was shadowed by some one, who came and went at night. For more than a year, until the day before it happened, we saw the strange man at intervals, but Tug said it would unnecessarily alarm you both to know it, so we kept it to ourselves. I am sorry we did it, but we thought then that it was for the best. I always wanted to tell you, but Tug, who worshipped you both, would never consent to it until the morning your husband went into the bottoms alone. When he came here and found that he had gone, he followed him, and has not been seen since. The day before, while rowing in the bottoms, I met the shadow, and when Tug heard this, he came at once to warn your husband not to venture out alone." Annie Dorris made no reply. Perhaps this was no more than she expected from Silas, whom she had sent for to question. "The shot which once came in at that window was fired by Tug," Davy continued, pointing to the pane which had been broken on the night of Allan Dorris's marriage to Annie Benton, "and he fired at the shadow as it was looking in at your husband. For more than a year Tug has carried a gun, and has tried to protect you, but he made a mistake in not giving warning of this stealthy enemy. Of late months he has spent his nights in walking around this place, trying to get a shot at the shadow. And though some people accuse him of a horrible crime because of his absence from town, he is really on the track of the guilty man, and will return to prove it. I cannot tell you how sorry I am to see you in mourning, but I hope you believe I did what I thought was for the best." When Silas had concluded, they were both silent and thoughtful, and the heavy breathing of little Ben was all the sound that could be heard. This attracted the attention of Silas, and he said, respectfully, "Would you mind kissing the boy, ma'am? The poor little fellow is so friendless, and has such a hard time of it, that he makes my heart ache. If you will be good enough, I will tell him of it, and he will always remember it gratefully. Poor chap! I don't suppose he was ever kissed in his life." Annie Dorris went over to the sleeping boy, and after kissing him, as had been requested, picked him up and laid him down on a lounge which stood in the room. "There was always something fierce and mysterious about my husband," Mrs. Dorris said, after a time. "But both attracted me to him. I could not help it. 100 times he has offered to tell me his story, but I did not care to hear it, so that now I know nothing about him except that he was the most worthy gentleman I ever knew, and combined all those qualities which my heart craved. I knew when we were first married that some such result as this was probable, but I could not resist him, and I do not regret it now. 3 months of such happiness as I have known will repay me for future years of loneliness, and his kindness and consideration are sweet memories, which console me even now while my grief is so fresh. He was manly and honorable with me in every way, and the fault, if there has been a fault, was my own. I am sure that he was a better man because of his misfortune. I believe now that trouble purifies men, and makes them better, and the more I studied him the more I was convinced that there were few like him, that a trifling thing had ruined his life, and that there were hundreds of men less honorable who were more fortunate. Even now I do not care to know more of him than I already know. I fear that this is a fault, but I knew him better than anyone else in the world, and his manner was so pathetic at times, and his love for me always so pronounced, that though I am now a young woman, I expect to spend my life in doing honor to a noble memory." There was something so womanly in her manner that Silas was convinced that she would live only to honor the memory of his friend. There was inexpressible sadness in her face, but there was also strength and capacity and love and honor. "I am the one person whose good opinion he cared for," she said again, "and I forget everything except his love for me, and his manliness in everything. It is nothing to me what he was away from here. A single atom in the human sea, he may have committed a wrong while attempting to do right, and came here a penitent, trying to right it. But as I knew him, he was worthy of any woman's profoundest admiration, and he shall receive it from me as long as I live. The stream of life leads upwards to heaven against a strong current, and, knowing myself, I do not wonder that occasionally the people forget, and float down with the tide. He has told me that he had but one apology to make to anyone, to me for not finding me sooner. This was a pretty and an undeserved compliment, but it was evident that in his own mind he did not feel that he had wronged anyone, and I feel so. I have no idle regrets, and do not blame you and Tug. On the contrary, I thank you both for your thoughtful care. When Tug returns, as I am sure he will, bring him here. Who has not wounded their best friends in trying to befriend them? Though you too have grievously wounded me, I recognize the goodness of your motives and feel grateful." She got up at this and started toward the door, motioning Silas to follow. From the dark hall she stepped through the door which Doris had never entered alive, but he had been carried there dead. A dim light burned near the door, and there was something in the air, a taint not to be described, but to be remembered with dread, which made Silas think of a sepulchre. On a raised platform, in the room to which the steps of poor Helen were always leading, stood a metallic burial case, with a movable lid showing the face under glass. The face was so natural that Silas thought it must have been preserved in some manner, for his friend seemed to be quietly sleeping, and he could not realize that he had been dead a week. Even before Silas had taken his hasty glance, Annie Dorris had knelt beside the inanimate clay of her husband, and he thought he had better go away, he could think of nothing else to do, and leave her. And this he did, only stopping at the door to see a picture which he never forgot: the coffin, the sobbing woman, the dim light, and the gloomy hangings of the room. On being awakened, little Ben shielded his face with his hands, as if expecting a blow, which was his usual greeting on opening his eyes; but recognizing his friend, he contentedly followed him down the stairs and out at the iron gate into the street. Davy was not a large man or a strong man, but little Ben found it difficult to follow him, and was compelled to ask his friend to stop and rest before they reached the hotel. When they finally reached the kitchen, they found it deserted, and Silas hastily placed meat and bread before the boy. This he devoured like a hungry wolf, and Davy wondered that such a little boy had so much room under his jacket. "They don't feed you overly well at the farm, do they, Ben?" Silas inquired. The boy had turned from the table, and was sitting with his hands clasped around his knees, and his bare feet on the upper round of the chair. After looking at his companion a moment, he thoughtfully shook his head. "You work hard enough, heaven knows," Silas said again, in a tone which sounded like a strong man pitying some one less unfortunate. But there was little difference between the two, except age, for there was every reason to believe that should little Ben's cough get better, he would become such a man as Silas was. "I do all I can," little Ben answered, "but I am so weak that I cannot do enough to satisfy them. I haven't had enough sleep in years. I think that is the trouble with me." "That cough, little Ben, is not the result of loss of sleep. You must have contracted that in going out to work in the early morning, illy clad, while other children were asleep. I'm going to tell you something, poor fellow," Silas said, "which will please you. While you were asleep up at The Locks to-night, the lady kissed you." Little Ben put his hand apologetically to his mouth, and coughed with a hoarse bark that startled Silas, for he noticed that the cough seemed worse every time the boy came to town. But he seemed to be only coughing to avoid crying, for there were tears in his eyes. "You are not going to cry, Ben?" Silas said in a voice that indicated that he was of that mind himself. "I think not, sir," the boy replied. "When I first went to the farm, I cried so much that I think that the tears have all left me. I was only thinking it was very kind of the lady, for nobody will have me about except you, Mr. Davy. My father and mother, they won't have me around, and I am in Mr. Quade's way. and his wife and children have so much trouble of their own that they cannot pay attention to me. They live very poorly, and work very hard, sir, and I do not blame them. But I often regret that I am always sick and tired, and that no one seems to care for me." Little Ben seemed to be running the matter over in his mind, for he was silent a long while. In rummaging among his recollections he found nothing pleasant, apparently, for when he turned his face to Silas, it showed the quivering and pathetic distortion which precedes an open burst of grief. "If you don't care," he said, "I believe I will cry. I can't help it, since you told me about the lady." The little fellow sobbed aloud at the recollection of his hard life, all the time trying to control himself, and wiping his eyes with his rough sleeve. He was such a picture of helpless grief that Silas Davy turned his back, and appeared to be rubbing something out of his eyes, first one and then the other. "I am sorry I am not able to help you, Ben," the good fellow said, turning toward the boy again, after he had recovered himself. "But I am of so little consequence that I am unable to help anyone. I cannot help myself much. I have rather a hard time getting along, too, and I am a good deal like you, Ben, for, though I work all the time, I do not give much satisfaction." Little Ben looked at his companion curiously. "I thought you were very happy here, sir," he said, "with plenty to eat every day. You are free to go to the cupboard whenever you are hungry, but often I am unable to sleep because I am so hungry. You never go to bed feeling that way, do you, Mr. Davy?" "No," he replied, almost smiling at the boy's idea that anyone who had plenty to eat must be entirely content. "But I am a shiftless sort of man, and I don't get on very well. I always want to do what is right and fair, but somehow I don't always do it. I sometimes think, though, that I am more unjust to myself than to anyone else. It causes me a good deal of regret that I am not able to help such as you, Ben. If I were able, I would like to buy you a suit of clothes." "Summer is coming on, sir, and these will do very well," the boy replied. "Yes, but you were very thinly clad last winter, Ben, and oftentimes I could not sleep from thinking of how cold you were when out in the fields with the stock. If ever there was a good boy, you are one, Ben. But you are not treated half so well as the bad boys I know. This is what worries me, as hunger worries you." "I am sorry to hear you are poor, sir," little Ben said. "Not that I want you to do more for me than you have done, but you have always been so kind to me that I thought you must be rich to afford it. You always have something for me when I come to town, and I am very thankful to you." What a friendless child, Davy thought, to consider what he had done for him the favor of a rich man. A little to eat, and small presents on holidays. He had been able to do no more than that, but since no one else was kind to the boy, these were magnificent favors in his eyes. "On with cheek did the lady kiss me, Mr. Davy?" the boy inquired later in the night. "On this one," Davy replied, touching his left cheek with his finger-tips. "I was thinking it was that one," little Ben continued. "There has been a glow in it ever since you told me. I should think that the boys who have mothers who do not hate them are very happy. Do you know whether they are, Mr. Davy?" "I know they ought to be," he said, "but some of them are very indifferent to their mothers. I have never had any experience myself. My own mother died before I could remember." "It seems to me," little Ben continued, "that if I were as well off as some of the boys I see, I should be entirely satisfied. I must start home soon, or I will not get there in time to be called for tomorrow's work, and when I creep into the hay, where I sleep after coming to see you, I intend to think that the kiss the lady gave me was the kiss of my mother, and that she does not hate me any more. For such as you, little Ben, there must be a heaven. The men who are strong in doubt, as well as in the world's battles, come to the conclusion, when they remember that there can be no other reward for such as you and Silas Davy, for your weakness is so unfit for this life that it must be a burden which can only be reckoned in your favor in the Master's house, where there are many mansions. If there were not so many happy children, little Ben said again, perhaps I should not mind it so much, but I see them wherever I go, and I cannot understand why my lot is so much harder than theirs. My bones ache so, and I want to sleep and rest so much that I cannot help feeling regret. Except for this I hope I would be happy as you are. Silas Davy is anything but a happy man, little Ben, but being a good man, he does not complain, and does the best he can. So when the boy soon after started for the farm, and Silas walked with him to the edge of the town, he pretended to be very well satisfied with himself, and with everything around him. Indeed, he was almost gay, but it was only mockery to encourage his unfortunate companion. "Next Christmas, Ben," Silas said as they walked along, "you shall have—" he paused a moment to consider his financial possibilities, "a sled from the store." "That is too much," Ben replied, with hope and gladness in his voice. "A sled will cost a great deal, for the painting and striping must come high. I would like to have a sled more than anything else, but I am afraid you would rob yourself in buying it. I am afraid that is too much, Mr. Davy." "It will not cost as much as you expect, and I can easily save the money between this and Christmas," the good fellow replied. "I have always wanted to do it, and I will, and it will be a pleasure. Remember, Ben, when you feel bad off in the future, what you are to get when you come to see me Christmas morning." "I will not forget, sir." "When you own the sled, and I have had the pleasure of giving it to you, we will feel like very fortunate fellows, won't we, Ben?" Silas said again, cheerfully, as they walked along. "We shall feel as though we are getting along in the world, I should think, Mr. Davy," the boy replied. They had reached the edge of the town by this time, and Davy stopped to turn back. He took the boy's hand for a moment, and said, "Remember the sled, Ben. Good night." "Good night, sir. I will not forget." Silas had scarcely said good night to him before he was lost to his sight. He was such a very little fellow. End of chapter 21. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 22 of The Mystery of the Locks by E.W. Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 22. Tug's Return. A month had passed since Allan Dorris was found floating over the mounds in Hedgepath graveyard, and the waters having gone down in the bottoms, the people were busy in rescuing their homes from the ooze and black mud beneath which they were buried. There had been so much destruction in the bottoms, and so much loss of trade in the town, that the people were all mourners like Annie Dorris and Silas Davy, and it did not seem probable that any of them would ever be cheerful again. Silas Davy was the only person in the town, save Annie Dorris, who knew the secret of the murder, and he kept it to himself, believing that Tug was on the trail of the culprit, and that nothing could be gained by making the people aware of the mysterious man and his mysterious visits. He was sure that Tug would return finally, when, if he saw fit, he might tell the people what he knew; otherwise they might continue their conjectures, which generally implicated Tug. From the day of the murder he had not been seen in the town, and while it was not openly charged that he had fired the fatal shot, a great many talked mysteriously of his disappearance, and believed that he had something to do with it, for about this time it became known that he had frequently been seen around the locks in the middle of the night, carrying a gun. Silas had gone down to the old house by the river to see if the bed gave any signs of having been occupied, as there was a possibility that Tug had returned, and was ashamed to make his presence known, not having accomplished his purpose. But there was no sign. The dust upon everything was proof enough that the owner was still away, and Silas was preparing to blow out the light and return to the hotel, when his friend came walking in at the door, ragged, dirty, and footsore, and a picture of poverty and woe, but there could be no doubt that it was Tug, for he carried in his right hand the old musket that had so long been his constant companion. His clothes hung in shreds about him, and bare skin appeared at his elbows and knees. His tall hat was so crumpled that it looked like a short hat, and his hair and whiskers were long and unkempt. There were bits of hay and twigs clinging to his clothing, and Silas was sure that he had been sleeping out at night, and creeping through the brush during the day. "Tug, my old friend," Silas said, in a voice trembling with excitement and pleasure. "God bless me, how glad I am to see you!" Tug sat down wearily in a chair, and laid the gun down at his feet. He was certainly very tired, and very hungry, and very weak, and Silas thought how fortunate it was he had brought a lunch with him, although he had only hoped that Tug would eat it. This he placed before his friend, who pulled his chair up to the table at sight of the sandwiches, and said in a hoarse voice, "I've caught an awful cold somewhere. Do you starve a cold or stuff it? I've been starving it for several days, and I think I'll try stuffing. You don't mean to tell me you have brandy in that bottle, do you?" It was brandy, fortunately, which Silas had been saving for his friend since his departure, but he seemed so tired now that he could not enjoy it with his old relish, for he did not look at it with his usual eagerness, and there was a melancholy air about him which was very distressing to the little man by his side. As Silas watched him, he thought that he discovered that he had grown a dozen years older within a month, and that he would never again be the contented, easy-going man he was before. He was a serious man now, too, a thing he had always despised, and it did not seem possible that he could ever recover from it. When he had finished his meal, he walked slowly and painfully over to the bed, and stretching out upon it, remained silent so long that Silas feared he had washed his voice down his throat with the brandy. "How is Mrs. Pretty?" he inquired at last, turning to Silas, who sat beside him. "Very poorly, I am sorry to say," Silas replied in a husky voice. This did not encourage Tug to talk, for he became silent again, and although Silas was keen to hear where his friend had been, he was silent too. "Have you told her that we were to blame?" Tug asked after a long pause. "Yes, I told her everything, but she does not blame us, and asked me to bring you up immediately after your return." There was the click in the ragged man's throat that usually distinguished him when he was about to laugh, but surely Tug had no intention of laughing now, though he wiped his big eye hurriedly, and in a manner indicating that he was vexed. "I might have known that it was wrong not to tell Allan Dorris of his enemy," Tug said. "I am usually wrong in everything, but I hoped I was doing them a favor in this matter. For who wouldn't worry to know that they were constantly watched by a man who seemed to have come a long distance for the purpose? They were so happy that I enjoyed it myself, and I wanted to protect them from the wolf, and though the wolf was smarter than I expected, I meant well. You know that." "I am sure of it," Davy replied. "A man who has been bad all his life cannot become good in an hour, and while I meant well, I did not know how to protect them from this danger. We should have taken them into our confidence when the wolf first appeared. I can see that now, after it is too late. It was my fault, though. You always wanted to. I'll have more confidence in you in future." Both men seemed to be busy thinking it all over for several minutes, for not a word was exchanged between them until Silas inquired, "Do you suppose there is any danger of the shadow molesting Mrs. Dorris?" Tug was lying on his back, and putting his hand under him, he took from his pistol pocket a package wrapped in newspapers, which looked like a sandwich. Handing this to Davy, he said, "Look at it." Going over to the table and the light, Davy began the work of unwrapping. There was a package inside of a package, which continued until a pile of newspapers lay on the table. At last he came to something wrapped in a piece of cloth, and opening this he found a human ear, cut off close to the head. He recognized it in a moment, the ear of the shadow, with the top gone. He hurriedly wrapped the horrible thing up as he had found it, and while he was about this he felt sure that Tug's journey had not been in vain, that somewhere he had encountered the shadow and killed him, bringing back the ear as a silent and eloquent witness. When the package had been returned to Tug's pocket, he turned on his side, rested his head on his hand, and told his story. "Out into the river like a shot. That's the way I rowed that misty morning when I found that Allan Dorris had gone into the bottoms alone. I had no idea where to go to find him, so I pulled over toward the hills on the east shore, where there was a slow current, and concluded to float down the stream. It may have been an hour later, while in the vicinity of the Big Bend, that I heard a shot below me. Rowing toward it with all my might, I soon came upon Allan Dorris lying dead in the bottom of his boat. Only stopping to convince myself that he was stone dead, I pulled out after his murderer. I knew who it was as well as if I had seen the shot fired, and I knew that he would be making down the river to escape, so I made down the river myself to prevent it. He had the start of me, and seemed to know the bottom better than I did, for when I came into the main current I could see him hurrying away, a good half-mile ahead of me. But I was the best rower, and within an hour I was coming within shooting distance, when he suddenly turned under the trees near the island where we saw him the first time. I lost track of him here for several hours, but at last I came upon his boat, a long distance up the creek, and just when I heard a whistle down at the station. Had I thought of this before, I might have found him there, and brought him back alive, for I have since found out that he signaled the train and went away on it. But it was too late then, so I could do nothing but go over to the station and wait for the next train." The narrator's hoarseness became so pronounced that Silas brought him the remaining brandy, which he tossed off at one swallow. "A lonely enough place it was," Tug continued, "and nobody around except the agent, who told me there would not be another train until a few hours after midnight, so I occupied myself in studying maps of the road. I had no money, of course, but I felt sure I could make my way to a certain big town several hundred miles away, which I had once heard Doris mention, and it had been in my mind ever since that he came from there. Of course, his enemy lived in the same place, and the certainty that the wolf came to the Bend on that road once, and went away by the same route, and the probability that he always came to the Bend from that station by rowing up the river, made me feel certain that the course I had mapped out was right. I need not tell you that I had trouble in traveling without money, for there are many people who cannot travel comfortably even when supplied with means in abundance. But in course of time I arrived in the city I once heard Doris mention, very tired, dirty, and hungry, as you will imagine, but not the least discouraged. For the more I heard about the place, and I inquired about it of everyone who would listen to me, the surer I was that I would find the wolf there. The people with whom I talked all had the greatest respect for the city, as they had here for Doris. This was one thing which made me feel sure he came from there, but there were a great many other evidences which do not occur to me now. I arrived in the morning, and there was so much noise in the streets that it gave me the headache, and so many people that I could not count them, therefore I cannot tell you the population of the place. It was so big and gay, though, that I am certain that the Bend City people would have been impressed as much as I was, though they put on airs over us. A Bend City man would have felt as much awe there as a Davy's Bend man feels in Bend City, and it did me a great deal of good to find out that Bend City is nothing but a dirty little hole after all. For 2 weeks I wandered about the streets looking for that ear. There were crowds of people walking and riding around who were like Allan Dorris in manners and dress, and I was sure that they all knew him and respected him, and regretted his departure, for I knew by this time that he came from that place to Davy's Bend. There was an independence and a rush about the town so unlike Davy's Bend, and so like Allan Dorris, that I was certain of it. Several times I thought of approaching some of the well-dressed people, and telling them that I was looking for the man who had murdered Allan Dorris, feeling sure that they would at once offer to assist me in the search. But I at last gave it up, fearing they would think he had taken a wonderful fall in the world to be friends with a man like me. One day, about 3 weeks after my arrival, I met the wolf on a crowded street. I tapped him on the shoulder, and when he turned to look at me, he trembled like a thief. "That matter of killing up at Davy's Bend," I said. "I am here to attend to it." He recovered his composure with an effort, and replied, "What's that to me, vagrant? Keep out of my way, or I'll have you jailed. I do not know you." "You are a liar," I replied, "and your manner shows it. I am dressed this way as a disguise. I have as good clothes as anybody when I choose to wear them. I am a private detective." I had heard that a great many vagrants claimed to be private detectives, so I tried it on him, and it worked well, for he at once handed me a card with an address printed on it, and said, "Call at that number to-night. I want to see you." He had probably heard of private detectives, too, for I knew he wanted to buy me off, so I consented to the arrangement, knowing that he would not run away. When it was dark, I went to the street and number printed on the card, and the wolf met me at the door of a house almost as big as The Locks, but land seemed to be valuable there, for others were built up close to it on both sides. There was a row of houses just alike, as far as I could see, but different numbers were printed on all of them to guide strangers. The wolf led the way upstairs, after carefully locking the door, and when we were seated in a room that looked like an office, and which was situated in the back part of the house, he said, "What do you want?" "I want to kill you," I replied. He was a tall, nervy man, but I was not afraid of him, for I am thick and stout. He laughed contemptuously and replied, "Do you know this man's offense?" "No," I answered, "but I know yours." He sat near a desk, and I felt sure that under the lid was concealed a pistol, therefore I found opportunity to turn the key quickly, and put it in my pocket. "Now you are in my power," I said to him. "You killed Allan Dorris, and I can prove it, and I intend to kill you." A very cool man was the Wolf, and he watched me from under his heavy eyebrows like a hawk, taking sharp note of everything I did, but he did not appear to be afraid. I couldn't help admiring the fellow's nerve, for he was the coolest man I ever saw, and there was an air of importance about him in his own house which did not appear when he was crawling around Davy's Bend. There was something about him that convinced me he was a doctor, like Dorris, though I heard nothing and saw nothing to confirm the belief. "I have had enough trouble over this affair already," he said, "and I am willing to pay for your silence. You don't know what you are about, but I do, and I know there is more justice in my cause than there is in yours. I have been actuated by principle, while you are merely a vagrant pursuing a hobby. You are interfering in the private affairs of respectable people, sir, and I offer you money with the contempt that I would throw a bone to a surly dog to avoid kicking him out of my way." "I am not a respectable man myself," I answered, "but I know that it is not respectable to shoot from behind. I give you final notice now that I don't want your money. I want your life, and I intend to have it. Back in the poor town I came from, there is a little woman whose face I could never look upon again were I to take your money, and I intend to be her friend and protector as long as I live. I believe the money you offer me belongs to Dorris, for you look like a thief who believes that every man is as dishonest as yourself, and has his price. Even my rags cry out against such a proposition." He was as cool as ever, and looked at me impudently until I had finished, when he said, "I want to step into the hall a moment." He knew I was watching the door to prevent his escape, and acknowledged that I was master of the situation by asking my permission. "To call help, probably," I said. "No, to call a weak, broken woman. I want you to see her. Whatever I have done, her condition has prompted me to." I opened the door for him, and he stepped into the dark hall, where he called "Alice" twice. I was so near him that he could not get away, and we stood there until Alice appeared at the other end of the hall. It was the little woman we had here one night. But though she was dressed better than when we saw her, she was paler, and when she came down the dark hall, carrying a candle above her head to light the way, I thought I had never before seen such a sickly person out of a grave. When she came up to us I saw that she was panting from her slight exertion, and we stepped into the room together. She did not know me, and looked at me with quiet dignity, as if she would conceal from me that she was weak and sick. "Does he bring news of him?" she asked, looking from me to the Wolf. The woman was crazy, there was no doubt of it. Had she not been, she would have fallen on her knees and said to me, as she did the night she was in his room, "Gentlemen, in the name of God," for I was determined to make way with a person who was probably her only protector. "Does the gentleman come from him?" the pale woman asked again. "She is the only person who ever called me a gentleman, and what little compassion I had before vanished." The Wolf paid no attention to her talk, and I thought he was accustomed to it. Perhaps she was always asking questions to which no reply could be given. She was not a young woman, and there was something about her, probably the result of her sickness, which was so repugnant that I almost felt faint. If she had walked toward me, I would have run out of the house, but fortunately she only looked at me. "If you came here at his request," the little woman said, as she stood in the middle of the room, "take this to him for me. I have been writing it for 2 years. It will explain everything." I thought the man was pleased because she had commenced the conversation so readily, for he appeared to be in good humor, as though she were saying exactly what he had desired she should to impress me. "When they told me he was contented in his new home," she continued, "I was satisfied, and I want him to know it. He had life and vigor and energy, and no one ever blamed him but Tom and me. This letter says so. I want you to take it to him. When I discovered that he disliked me, and would always neglect me, it was a cruel blow, though he was not to blame for it, for other men have honestly repented of their fancies. I could not think of him as a bad man for no other reason than that he was dissatisfied with me, for all the people were his friends, and he must have deserved their friendship. I suppose a man may form a dislike for his wife as naturally as he forms a dislike for anything else. I have reason to know that they can, and not commit a graver offense than one who happens to dislike any other trifle which displeases him. I would have told him this myself, had he not kept out of my way so long. It is all written in this letter, and my name is signed to it. I commission you to give it to him." She took from her bosom and handed me a crumpled piece of paper, on which nothing was written, but I carefully put it in my pocket, to humor her strange whim. "I am satisfied now, since I have heard that he is contented, and if Tom is willing we will never refer to the matter again. He is a good man. Even Tom says that between his curses, and why not let him alone? Tell him that Alice gave you the letter with her own hands, and that she will not live long to annoy him. Tell him that Alice rejoices to know that he is contented, for Tom has told me all about it, and since my sickness it has been a pleasure for me to think that a worthy man, and he is a worthy man, for no one can say aught against him except that he could not admire me, which does not seem to be a very grave offense, for no one else admires me, has found what his ability and industry entitles him to: peace. Peace! How he must enjoy it! How long he has sought it! I can understand the relish with which he enjoys it." The wolf was not pleased with this sort of talk. It was not crazy enough to suit him, and he looked at her with anger and indignation in his ugly face. "I never said it before, Tom," she continued, evidently frightened at his wicked look, "but I must say it now, for I cannot remember the hate you tried to teach me. I can only remember that a man capable of loving and being loved buried himself with a woman he could not tolerate, all from a sense of duty, and looked out at the merry world only to covet it. I have forgotten the selfishness which occupies every human heart. It was driven out of my nature with hope and ambition, and I am only just when I say that he deserved pity as well as I. He was capable of something better than such a life, and was worthy of it. I might have been worthy, but I was not capable, and was it right to sacrifice him because I crept while he ran? Do we not praise men for remedying their mistakes? You know we do, and I only praise him for it. Nothing more. The truth should always be written on a tomb. This house is like a tomb. It is so cold and damp, and I must tell the truth here. I am cold. Why don't you build a fire?" She put her hand into the flame of the candle she carried to warm it, but it did not burn, very much to my surprise. and she looked at me with quiet assurance while she warmed her hands in this odd manner. As I watched her, I noticed that the wild look which marked her face when she first appeared was returning. Her craze came back to her, and she put it on with a shiver. "Your feet are resting on a grave," she said to me again, after staring around the room a while, and as coolly as she might have called my attention to muddy boots. "Please take them off. It may be his grave. I have brought flowers to decorate it, an armful. Stand aside, sir." I did as she told me, and, advancing toward where I sat, she pretended to throw something on nothing out of her empty hands. "I came across a grave in the lower hall this morning, Tom," she said to the wolf, pausing, and she said it with so much indifference that I thought she must have meant a moth. "Of course they would not be together. I have never expected that. The grave in the hall was shorter than this one, and it was neglected. But this shows care. And look, Tom, the flowers I threw upon it are gone already." There was surprise and pain in the little woman's voice, and she pretended to throw other flowers from her withered hands on the mound her disordered fancy had created. "They disappear before they touch it," she said. I almost expected to speak and protest against any attention from me. And it is sinking, trying to get away from me. How much his grave is like him! It shrinks away from me. I'll gather them up. I'll not leave them here. Out of the air she seemed to be collecting wreaths, and crosses, and flowers of every kind, and putting them back into her arms. I will put them on the neglected mound in the lower hall, for no one else will do it. How odd the fair flowers will look on a background of weeds! But there shall be roses and violets on my grave, though I am compelled to put them there. Open the door, Tom. My strength is failing. I must hurry." The door was opened, and she passed out of it, and down the dark hall, staggering as she went. When she reached the door through which she came at the wolf's call, at the lower end of the passage, she turned around, held the candle above her head again, and said, "Be merciful, Tom. I request that of you as a favor. You were never wronged by him, except through me, and I have never been resentful except to please you. Let the gentleman return and deliver the letter I gave him." Opening the door near which she stood, she disappeared. So Tom was the cause of all this trouble? I resolved as we stepped back into the room that he should regret it, and I think there is no doubt that he does. Tug turned on his back again, and seemed to be considering what course he had better pursue with reference to the remainder of his story. At last he got up from the bed slowly and painfully, and walked over to the cupboard where his law book was kept, which he took down and opened on the table. After turning over its pages for a while, pausing occasionally to read the decisions presented, he shut up the book, returned it to the shelf, and went back to the bed. "I am too much of a lawyer," he said, "to criminate myself, partner, and you'll have to excuse me from going into further details. But I can give you a few conjectures. In my opinion, the pale, ugly little woman without a mind, but who looked respectable enough, was once Allan Dorris's wife, but I don't know it. I heard nothing to confirm this suspicion except what I have told you. The wolf was her brother, a man with an uglier disposition I never laid eyes on, and I shall always believe that Dorris married her when a very young man, that he finally gave her most of his property and struck out, resolved to hide from a woman who had always been a burden and a humiliation to him. It is possible that he was divorced from her a great many years before he came here, and that she lost her mind in consequence. It is possible that he had nothing to do with her, but I give you my guess, with the understanding that it is to go no farther. I am not in the habit of telling the truth, but this is the truth. I know no more about his past history than you do, but while in the city I came to the conclusion I have just given you." There was another short silence, and Silas became aware of the fact that Tug was breathing heavily, and that for the first time since he had known him he was asleep in his own house at night. End of chapter 22. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 23 of The Mystery of the Locks by E.W. Howe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 23. The Going Down of the Sun. 2 years have passed since the great flood in the river, which is still told about with wonder by those who witnessed it, and Tug Whittle is now living in the detached building at the Locks, which was occupied so long by Mrs. Wedge, that worthy lady having long since taken a room in the main house. Little Ben, released from his hard work at Quade's, is growing steadily worse, in spite of the kindness shown him by Mrs. Dorris and Mrs. Wedge. A victim of too much work is little Ben, but he is as mild and gentle as ever, and spends his days, when he is able, in wandering about the yard and keeping out of the way, for he cannot forget the time when every hand was against him. Mr. Whittle has become an industrious man during the 2 years, and is as devoted to Mrs. Dorris and her little child as it is possible for a man to be. The day after Tug's return to the Bend from his tramp to the lower country, he called on Mrs. Dorris, and related his story as he related it to Silas Davy, and going into the little detached house after its conclusion, he did not come out again for 2 days and nights, and it was supposed that he was making up for lost sleep. After his appearance he was fed by Mrs. Wedge, and at once began to make himself useful around the place. In a little while they learned to trust him, and he soon took charge of everything, conducting himself so well that there was never any reason for regretting the trust reposed. Allan Dorris had died possessed of several farms in the adjoining neighborhood, and these Mr. Whittle worked to so much advantage, with the aid of tenants on each, that in a financial way Mrs. Dorris got on very well, for Mr. Whittle wanted nothing for himself except the privilege of serving her as he did. Very often he was absent from the Locks for weeks at a time, looking after the farm affairs, and he seldom visited his mistress except to give accounts of his stewardship, which were always satisfactory. He had been heard to say that it was his fault that she was a widow, therefore he did not care to see her except when it seemed to be necessary, for her modest grief gave him such pangs of remorse that he wanted to take the musket, which he still retained in times of peace, and make away with himself. Therefore he spent much of his time in managing her affairs, which called him out of town, and he became known as a tremendous worker, to rival his record as a loafer, Mr. Whittle himself said. But Silas Davy knew, and even the people admitted it, that he was greatly devoted to his young mistress, and that he had no other aim in life than to make her as comfortable as possible in her widowed condition. Occasionally he came to town on an errand after nightfall, and returned to the country before day, as little Ben had done, and usually they only knew he had been around the house at all by something he had left for their surprise in the morning. If he found anything in the country he thought would please Mrs. Dorris or little Ben, he went to town with it after his day's work on the farm, and left his bed in the detached house before day to return. Besides the harm he had done Mrs. Dorris, the wrong he had done his son was on his mind a great deal, and he avoided the boy whenever it was possible. He was ashamed to look into his face, though he was always doing something to please him. His rough experience on the farm had forever ruined the boy's health, and his father was continually expecting to be summoned from the field to attend his funeral. Tug was still rugged and rough, and unsociable with those with whom he came in contact in the field or on the road, but he loved those in The Locks, from Mrs. Dorris down to the baby, with a devotion which made him a more famous character than he had ever been as a vagrant. He had become scrupulously honest and truthful, as well as industrious, and those who marveled at the change were told by the wiser heads that Tug had something on his mind which he was trying to relieve by good works. Silas Davy no longer had reason to regret that he was unable to buy little Ben a suit of clothes, for little Ben was well clothed now, and comfortably situated, except as to his cough. But in other respects the clerk had not changed for the better. He was still employed at the hotel, and still heard the boarders threaten to move to Ben's City, for Davy's Bend continued to go slowly down the hill. He still heard Armsby boast of his fancy shots and of his triumphs in the lodge, and worst of all, he still heard patient Mrs. Armsby complain of overwork, and knew that it was true. He occasionally went to The Locks to see Mr. Whittle, usually on Sunday evening, when that worthy was most likely to be at home, and as we come upon them now, to take a last look at them, it is Sunday evening, and Tug and Silas are seated on a rude bench in front of the detached house, with little Ben between them. "I have come to the conclusion, Mr. Davy." Tug is wonderfully polite recently, and no longer refers to his companion by his first name. "I have come to the conclusion that there is only one way to get along. It is expressed in a word of 4 letters: work. Busy men do not commit great crimes, and they know more peace than those who are idle. Therefore the best way to live is to behave yourself. I don't know whether I can behave myself enough from now on to do any good or not, but I intend to try." "I think you can, Tug," Davy replied. "You have been very useful during the past 2 years." "But I have been very useless during the past 40 and odd," Mr. Whittle continued, looking at little Ben as though he were evidence of it. "I have changed my mind about everything, with one exception, within a few years. Except that I do not believe a certain person is good, I have no opinion now that I had a year ago, but on this I will never change. My acquaintance with Dorris and his wife has taught me a good many things which I did not know before. His bravery taught me that bravery comes of a clear conscience, and his wife's goodness and devotion teach me to believe that a dead man is not so bad off after all. Did you know that she expects to meet her husband again?" Tug waved his hand above his head, intended as an intimation that Mrs. Dorris expected to meet her husband in heaven, and looked at Silas very gravely, who only nodded his head. "She seems to know it," Tug continued, "and why should I dispute her? How much more do I know than Annie Dorris? By what right do I say that she is wrong and that I am right? She is good enough to receive messages, but I am not. And it has occurred to me that I had better be guided by her. I have never been converted, or anything of that kind, but I have felt regret for my faults. I have done more than that. I have said aloud, as I worked in the fields, 'I'm sorry.' I have frequently said that, maybe only to myself, but maybe to the winds, which are always hurrying no one knows where. Who knows where they may carry the sound when a wicked man says sincerely, 'I'm sorry.'" Sure enough, who knows? May it not be to heaven? I have heard her play hymns on the organ which I felt must be songs of hope, the words of which promised mercy, for they sounded like it, and she does not play them for amusement. I believe it is her offering for the peace of Allan Dorris, and a prayer could not go farther into heaven than her music. I have known her to go to the church with the little baby, and I should think that when the Lord hears the music, and looks down and sees Annie Dorris and the child, he would forget a great deal when Dorris comes before him. Silas had heard the music too, and he agreed that if it could have been set to words, they would have been "Mercy, mercy." "I am too old a crow to be sentimental," Tug said again, "but I have felt so much better since I have been working and behaving myself that I intend to keep it up, and try and wipe out a part of my former record. If I should go to sleep some night and not waken in the morning as usual to go away to work, very good. But if I should waken in a strange place, I should like to meet Allan Dorris, and hear him say, 'Tug, I have reason to know that erring men who have ever tried to do right receive a great deal of consideration here. You have done much toward redeeming yourself.'" Silas was very much surprised to hear his companion talk in this manner, and said something to that effect. "I am surprised myself," Tug answered, "but the devotion of Annie Dorris to the memory of her husband has set me to thinking. The people believe that Allan Dorris was buried in the Locks yard, by Thompson Benton, but I know that his iron coffin still stands in the room where you saw it. I think his clay feels grateful for the favor, for it has never been offensive like ordinary flesh. The lid has been shut down, never to be opened again, but when I last looked under it, I saw little except what you might find in the road: dust." The chill of the evening air reminds them that it is time for little Ben to go in, but the two men remain outside to look at the sunset. "The people of this town," Mr. Whittle continued, after the boy had disappeared, "are greatly amused over the statement that when an ostrich is pursued, it buries its head in the sand and imagines that it is hid. I tell you that we are a community of ostriches. I occasionally put a head into the sand myself, and so do you, and all the rest of them. When little Ben is near me, I try to cause him to forget the years I neglected him, by being kind, but he never looks at me with his mild eyes that I do not fear he is thinking, 'You only have your head in the sand, and there is so much of you in sight that I remember Quade. Therefore I keep out of his way whenever I can. Do you think his cough is any better?" "I am afraid not, Tug," Silas replied. "I was thinking today that it is growing steadily worse." Tug looked toward the setting sun and the church, and the solemn tones of the organ came to them. Annie Dorris was playing the hymn the words of which seemed to be "Mercy, mercy." "Word will be sent to you some day," Tug said, as if the music had suggested it, "that little Ben is—" He paused and shivered, dreading to pronounce the word "worse." "I wish you would get word to me some way, without letting anyone know it. I want to go away somewhere. Then you can come out for me, and tell them on your return that I could not be found. It is bad enough for me to look at him now. I could never forget my sin toward him, were I to see him dead. Of course you will go with him to the cemetery, with Mrs. Dorris and Mrs. Wedge and Betty. And I would like to have the baby at poor Ben's funeral, for he thinks so much of it, but it will be better for me to stay away, though I want them to think it accidental. When I return you can show me the place, and on my way to and from the town I will stop there and think of the hymn which Mrs. Dorris plays so much." The sun is going down, and it seems to pause on the hill to take a last look at the town. Perhaps it is tired of seeing it from day to day, and will in future travel a new route, where objects of more interest may be seen. Anyway, it lingers on the hill, and looks at the ragged streets and houses of the unfortunate town down by the river, which is always hurrying away, as if to warn the people below to avoid Davy's Bend, where there is little business and no joy. When its face is half obscured by the hill, the sun seems to remember The Locks, with whose history it has been familiar, and looks that way. So much shadow has gathered around it already from the woods across the river, that objects are no longer to be distinguished. Nothing but the huge outlines. At last the sun disappears behind the hill, but a friendly ray comes back, and looks toward The Locks until even the church steeple disappears, and Davy's Bend and The Locks, with its sorrow and its step on the stair, are lost in the darkness. End of chapter 23. Recording by Roger Melin. End of The Mystery of the Locks by E. W. Howe.